The Samaritans are the tiny remnant left of the northern kingdom remnants.
Wow.
And there are fewer than 1,000 Samaritans today. Jews and Samaritans are worshiping the same God. The Samaritans are observing the Shabbat, the Sabbath, the same as the Jews, the same dietary laws, the same festivals, Yom Kippur, etc.
But they would not consider themselves to be Jews.
They're not Jews. They don't consider themselves to be Jews, and Jews don't consider them to be Jews. They're a separate minority religious group.
Yeah.
But they are part of the house of Israel.
Right. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a
Yes,
really remarkable
absolutely.
thing. They are part of the house of Israel.
Right. Yeah.
DNA studies show almost no distinction between Jews and Samaritans.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
I talk to my students about this, the distinction between the terms Hebrew, Israelite, and Jew.
Yeah.
Because, Abraham is a Hebrew, but it would make no sense to call him a Jew.
Right.
Even though he's considered the father of the
Right.
Jews. But he's
Right.
also father of the Arabs,
Right.
so. Dr. Gary Rendsburg, welcome to Stunned by Scripture.
Thank you, John.
This has been a long time in the making and such a delight and honor for me. I was going to say you're a childhood hero, but that would be a bit of an exaggeration. A later in life, but still a young hero. When I was seminary, I was introduced to your work in seminary. I think my exegesis class is in Pentateuch. We used your redaction of Genesis. And I was so impressed by that. I thought, this is really useful. This is super helpful in understanding the macro structure of the book of Genesis and the literary artistry. And then when I continued on in graduate school and into my doctoral program, I would run across your work, your articles on such a wide variety of subjects. And nothing you wrote was boring.
May we say that about all of our own publications.
Yes,
Thank you, John,
right.
For that.
Right. And most of the time I would agree with you. Once or twice, I don't know. But even when I did not agree with some approach or position that you took, I was never bored by anything that you wrote, and I was always stimulated to do my own research, and was always refreshed by the way that you thought outside the box. So much of scholarship, I guess in many fields, but in biblical studies as well, early on folks learn that by rehearsing the positions of their doctor fodder or whatever's popular in the field, they can make themselves a good academic career. And you've never given into that. I try not to give into that. I hope that we've both been successful in trying to pursue truth and not just make careers. So Dr. Rendsburg, a delight. Again, thank you so much for traveling out to humble Steubenville, Ohio.
My pleasure.
Have you ever heard of Steubenville before?
I have heard of Steubenville.
Okay, good. That's more than most people.
Sometimes because I'm reading a John Bergsma article and it says Franciscan University of Steubenville.
Okay. Well, Dr. Rendsburg, Gary, on this show, we do several things, but one thing we want to do is always, discuss how Scripture impacts us personally and our own intellectual journeys, our own spiritual journeys, and how we got to where we are. And we always start the show by allowing the guest to tell their own spiritual and intellectual journey and how Scripture impacted that, their own kind of walk with God's Word, as it were, through their lifespan. So having said that, I want to open the floor. Tell us about how you got to where you are, one of the most widely and internationally respected scholars of Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, of the Hebrew language. You're welcomed, and we'll talk about this more, you're welcomed by all circles, secular institutions, Catholic institutions, Jewish institutions, Latter-day Saint institutions, et cetera, and we'll discuss that. But everybody welcomes Dr. Gary Rendsburg. How did you get to this position? What was that journey like from childhood to today?
That's a great way to start, John. And of course, we all reflect back on our journeys and our childhoods and how do we get from place A to place B. I grew up in a typical and yet atypical American Jewish home. for the first 10 years of my life in Baltimore, and then we moved to New Jersey, which is to say Jewish traditions were alive in our home, lighting candles on Shabbat, going to synagogue, the festivals, the Passover Seder, and so on. It was atypical because my parents are Holocaust survivors. It depends on how you define that term. My father actually survived the concentration camps.
Wow.
My mother lived under the Nazis but was never in the camps.
Okay.
And she was able to get out eventually at the age of 15 to go to England.
While the war was in progress?
No, in 1939, just before the war started, spring of 39.
Okay.
And went to England as a 15-year-old,
Wow.
where she came of age. So as I reflect back on it, we were, acculturated into American culture, but of course there was a lot of German in the home,
Sure.
especially with my grandmother, although her English was fine.
Yiddish?
No Yiddish. German Jews were speaking German.
Hochdeutsch?
Auf Deutsch, yeah. Which does allow you, however, to understand almost everything in Yiddish, since Yiddish is basically a early dialect of German. And knowing that there were very few relatives in America, but that I had lots of relatives in Israel, where I had aunts and uncles and cousins and so on. Sure. I had one first cousin in the U.S. and 10 in Israel, just to give you an example of that diaspora of a diaspora, right?
Sure.
To what extent did that affect me? It's hard to know. Here I am, many, many decades later, still reflecting on that question. But what I can tell you is that there was an intellectual tradition in the family, especially on my mother's side.
Right.
My grandfather had been a cantor at a prominent synagogue in Berlin, as were his brothers. Very musical family. Yeah. My uncle, my mother's brother, had been training for the rabbinate. He actually had studied with Martin Buber in Germany, and others of that great generation before they all dispersed to Israel and so on. So there was an intellectual trickle down in some way. Right. I was very close to my uncle, but he lived in Israel, so how often did I see him? In later years, I did much more. Good. And we shared all those great intellectual interests, and he was the first one who took me to archaeological sites in Israel, right? Okay. When I was 21 years old. I mean, I still have the fondest of memories. That generation, needless to say, has all passed. But my first love was actually English literature.
Okay.
Somehow, I remember just being enamored by it all in high school, and then in college was an English major. And was doing a lot of Old and Middle English and Renaissance English, which actually still informs some of my publications, including a recent article that I wrote. So if you know German, as I did, Old and Middle English aren't
not that hard
because German and English have the same roots, along with Dutch. And so I was able to do a little Germanic linguistics and so on, and probably was going to go on to do a PhD in that field. But I was also taking all the Hebrew courses and some religion courses. This was at University of North Carolina.
Okay, UNC. Okay.
UNC Chapel Hill, which is 8 miles from Duke University. So the two universities collaborated and still do to a great extent on various academic programs. Basketball rivalry notwithstanding, they're able to keep that outside the classroom. And my primary teacher was actually Eric Myers of Duke University.
Okay, well known.
Great scholar. Biblical scholar and field archaeologist. And eventually I decided in my senior year, I really want to do a PhD in some facet of Jewish studies, Hebrew language, Bible, etc. Never lost that love for the English material, and I still will pick up my Chaucer from time to time and read it. And off I went to NYU for the MA PhD program, where one of the great luminaries in our field of the 20th century, Cyrus Gordon, was teaching. Now, he was at the more towards the end of his career. Right. When I arrived there, he was 68 years old, but he was still teaching. He taught for 12 years until the age of 80 when he retired. He was extremely dynamic, still dynamic. Sure. And people at UNC and Duke, both Eric Myers and Jack Sasson, had studied with him, so I already knew the name, of course. And it didn't take me long to realize that I had made the right decision.
Sure.
He was a phenomenal teacher.
Yes.
And he knew it all.
Yeah.
One of my colleagues once said, who had also studied with Gordon, once said, there are a lot of great scholars in our field, but so many of them just can't teach. Gordon was also a master pedagogue.
Yeah.
And he brought all those subjects alive.
Yeah.
And of course, we just called him Cyrus the Great.
Of course.
And
what made him a good pedagogue?
He could teach a seminar with first-year grad students, even advanced undergraduates at times, and fourth or fifth-year doctoral students in the same room. And he could teach the same material at the level you were at and could direct you to learn at your level.
Wow.
So if it was an advanced element of Ugaritic or Akkadian grammar, the first or second year Hebrew student may not get it all, but that first or second year Hebrew student would hear it for the first time, and maybe a couple of months later or the next academic year would then catch on at a greater rate and faster. He was just phenomenal at that. And he played off your knowledge. So if somebody had field archaeology knowledge, if somebody knew Akkadian, if somebody knew hieroglyphics, somebody knew Aramaic, somebody who came from a much more traditional Jewish background than I did and had studied a lot of Talmud, for example, he could just direct whatever we were doing to that individual, and we would all learn from each other. But he was a master in controlling the classroom that way.
He knew it all.
Pardon?
He knew all these
because
areas.
He knew it all,
right? So
and had done field archaeology and had studied hieroglyphics and Akkadian and had made major contributions in all of those fields.
Right. Yeah.
During his long and illustrious career.
Sure.
For our viewers who don't know, his dates of his life are 1908 to 2001. Right. So he lived to the age of 92 or so.
Right.
And I was very close with him for his post-retirement years, would visit him constantly at his home in the Boston area, and including just shortly before he passed.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Wikipedia kind of identifies you as his successors,
well,
for what it's worth.
I'm very happy and honored to take that, to have that as my sobriquet.
Yeah. And like yourself, Gordon was well received by a wide variety of different constituencies, different religious groups, although my understanding was he wasn't particularly devout himself, you might say, but he seemed to have a respect for people's religious devotion and never was condescending or critical.
Right.
And so he was well loved by evangelical Protestants and Catholics and and the secular field well respected as well.
Yeah, he grew up in a traditional Jewish home, also in Philadelphia, and received a very good traditional education, and taught for much of his career in what we would call Jewish institutions. Dropsy College in Philadelphia, which no longer exists, it was folded into the University of Pennsylvania, and Brandeis University, which they're not officially Jewish; they're open to everyone, both Dropsy and Brandeis. But that's where most of his career was, at those two institutions post World War II. And NYU, of course, is a totally private institution, but by its location in New York City, by definition, has a large Jewish student population. And he was always very respectful of all the groups, and we had absolutely, everybody in our classroom. Yeah. And he did attract people from all denominations, and in fact, from around the world. I mean, people came to Brandeis from Japan to study with him.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
And as an example, and from other places as well. So
did Ashita come to study with him?
David Sumera.
Okay.
Became a great, still still producing great scholarship on Ugaritic. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So with whom I'm in, relatively close touch. Of course, email has made it much more easy to remain in touch, but we still see each other at conferences, which is nice as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So getting back to your story, so in your undergraduate work at UNC, you're studying English literature, but you're also studying Hebrew and keeping a solid foot in biblical studies. And then as that comes to a close, you decide yourself, I really want to go on. And was there a spiritual component to that? Was your parents' own experience play a role at all, or?
Well, I'll go back to what I said. I'm still pondering that question. In other words, if they had not been Holocaust survivors, if I had just grown up with American-born parents, would it have been any different? And it may have been no different. Of course, those are unanswerable questions. But I suspect that knowing that I had, somehow it just percolates into your essence of that kind of a family history, which had been in Germany for centuries. We have our family tree reaching back into the 18th century, as far back as the records allow us to go. So, the idea of a continuity, that was for me, that was a major important part of it, a continuity.
Yeah.
And to keep Jewish tradition alive, which of course you can do without being an academic, as the vast majority of traditionally minded Jews do. But I had something to offer, I thought, as an academic in the field, which would allow me to do both, the love of the synagogue, the love of the liturgy, the love of family, and also make it my academic world.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So we get to NYU. Now you're in your doctoral studies at that point.
Well,
with
I did.
Gordon,
it was an MA, PhD. You got your MA along the way, basically.
Start working at the master's level, and then the doctorate.
Yeah.
So, and you got there. You had heard of Gordon by reputation before.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You got there and realized I did make the right choice. He lives up to the reputation. This is great to work with him. And then you have other decisions to make, like you need to narrow down, okay, what am I going to work on? So how did that unfold? How did you come? You eventually worked on spoken Hebrew in the biblical period. So what were the different options, and what did you decide, I'm not going to work on that, and narrowed you down?
So I always loved language. So I didn't mention this, but as an undergraduate, I took several linguistics courses. And of course, if you're doing Old and Middle English and you're thinking about your own modern English and you're thinking about the German that I know and you're seeing connections and so on. So I always loved language. I was attuned to the fact that my parents spoke slightly different dialects of German. I could, I just could hear it. And there was a lot of bilingual punning in our house growing up, I have to say. With my aunt and my cousin and so on as well. So all of that sort of, you just absorb that when you're in a household. And so for my PhD, just doing the usual kind of reading. And I remember reading a few articles by Hebraists of that generation, Chaim Rabin and Edward Uhlendorf in particular. Chaim Rabin of the Hebrew University, Edward Uhlendorf of University College London, of SOAS in London. And they had written some articles thinking about what was spoken Hebrew like. Was it like the biblical Hebrew narrative prose that we have for people who are watching who know such things as the Wayik form, where they actually speaking that way? And G.R. Driver had written a little bit on that. And so I just sort of discovered these articles and started thinking about, can we reconstruct, on the basis of the biblical text, what the spoken Hebrew of the times was like? And anybody who's listening to this is going to say, well, you don't have recordings, how could you possibly do that? And I also have to say, which I learned pretty quickly by doing the research, that you might say, well, just look at all the quoted text.
Right.
Maybe not from God, but Abraham to Sarah, or Joseph to his brothers, or when they're actually families talking to each other. And it turns out that Hebrew is actually the same as the third-person narration. It's not shifting into a colloquial form in a way that Faulkner might have done or Mark Twain might have done.
Sure.
So that that doesn't help too much either. And eventually, I realized, and it wasn't just me alone, but that there are, as you know, the biblical text bristles with difficulties.
Yeah.
And many of the departures from the grammatical norm turn out to be spoken colloquial forms.
Okay.
grammatical. I'm talking mainly grammar here, not the lexicon so much. And so I built a case for using those departures from grammatical norms not to be amended to fit the grammatical norms that we all learn in our grammar textbooks, which was the norm in biblical studies, but rather to treasure those departures from the grammatical norm and to see them as evidence for the spoken Hebrew of biblical times. And that's how I built the case.
Good.
Yeah.
So what other scholars might have come along and said, well, these must be scribal errors that have crept in or something like that.
Well, 90% of the scholars probably were saying things like that.
Right.
So,
and you're saying, no,
right,
let's take a look at these.
Let's take a look at these.
Yeah. Do you still defend that to this day?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. So let's introduce the term diglossia. Diglossia is a well-known linguistic term, and it means something like two tongues. And it's used by linguists to describe the phenomenon of languages which have different spoken and written registers.
Okay.
And the classical example of that in world languages is Arabic, where classical Arabic is a learned language which is used for writing, maybe for parliamentary addresses in very high formal government affairs. But on the street, growing up in a household, whether you're in Egypt or Syria or Iraq or wherever you are, you're speaking your local colloquial dialect. Mm-hmm. And school children almost have to learn the classical language to read Arabic, Quran, or any text. Ditto for Christian Arabs. Reading the Bible in Arabic, almost have to learn it as you and I would learn a foreign language.
Sure.
So that sort of classical and spoken Arabic, the differences between them parallel what I was noticing in the Hebrew.
Interesting.
That the classical Hebrew looks like the classical Arabic, they're related Semitic languages, and the departures from the grammatical norm begin to look like the same departures from the grammatical norm in colloquial Arabic. And so that was a big part of building this case.
Sure.
And I still hold by it. And in fact, at a distance of more than 40 years, I was just invited to write an article for a journal in which I sort of summarized all of that material,
right,
and brought it up to date, and bibliography was brought up to date, and so on. So I had a good time revisiting all that material. It was published in the journal Religions, which sounds like it should be about religion, but somebody wanted to do something about language, and so the editor invited me to contribute an article on my diglossia in ancient Hebrew.
Yeah. Now, one of the interesting things about that study is it presumes then that the Masoretic text, which is the traditional Hebrew text of the Hebrew Bible, has preserved these forms for centuries without revision, without being kind of rewritten in a later dialect.
That is absolutely correct. And most of these spoken forms are probably subconscious incursions into the written classical form.
Okay.
I mean, the scribe, if I'm correct about this diglossic situation, is writing standard written Hebrew, but is, in his mind thinking in his own spoken Hebrew. And we do that in English as well. Now, in English, the written and spoken forms are not all that different.
Right.
I mean, you and I could point out a few things, but if I just said you and I could point out a few things, that would sound the same both in written and spoken. And every once in a while you'll get these, and you and I probably catch ourselves when we're writing, saying, no, that's a little too colloquial.
Right.
But the biblical text has preserved them, and that's the wonder of the ancient scribes.
Yeah.
Right? Once it's there in the text, it's there and it gets transmitted with care and precision and respect so that it'll be passed down until we get to our Dead Sea Scrolls and eventually our medieval manuscripts, and there they are.
Yeah. Now, I like that. That's fascinating. And, for those that treasure the sacred text, there's something comforting about the thought that, it was curated over the centuries, treated with respect and care so that, what we're reading from the time of David, et cetera, is representative, et cetera. But what would you say about folks who take, for example, the variations in the biblical text that we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which you just mentioned, and say, oh, look, the text was completely fluid. People were doing whatever they wanted with it. Because there are scholars out there making that argument. And what would you say?
There is textual fluidity. I mean, the data are absolutely clear. If we have dozens of copies from Psalms, or just take the Great Isaiah Scroll versus the 1Q Isaiah B Scroll, yes, there is textual fluidity, by which we mean that no single text is the same, no single copy, I should say, is the same as the other one. That said, for all of the textual fluidity, none of the changes are going to upset humanity or the divine. Let's talk about one that actually does, let's just give an example. In the Hebrew Masoretic text, Goliath is 6 cubits and a span high. Yeah. So if a cubit is about 18 inches, right, and a span is the span of a hand, it turns out that he's something like 8 feet 9 or something like that, beyond the realm of human capacity. The Septuagint, and now the Dead Sea Scroll fragment of Samuel there, reads 4 cubits and a span. Right. So that's about 6'6". And that puts us in the realm of human capacity. Right. I suspect that's the original text, if there is an original text. I never like to speak of that. But that just gives people a ready example. Perhaps you use it when you teach as well, that we all like to use. It's a good example. Or the number of Israelites who went down to Egypt. These are all very minor points. With all of the textual fluidity, nothing changes. Mm-hmm. In other words, Abraham is still the founder of tradition. The covenant still gets passed through Isaac and Jacob, not through Ishmael and Esau. Joseph is still sold by his brothers. There's still an Exodus. There's still a tabernacle. There's still a David. There's still a Solomon. There's still a temple. Right. There's still a Sabbath. The dietary laws are the same. There's no biblical text that says you can eat pigs. Everything remains, right? And people, I think, get overly exercised about these minor variations in the text. Yeah. The overarching narrative is still there. Creation still took 6 days. Right.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because the textual fluidity bothered, our colleague Bart Ehrman so much. He writes about this, that, it kind of destroyed his kind of religious understanding. And I'm not sure if he's an atheist, but anyway, it was earth-shaking for him. But you make a good point. Whether Goliath was a foot higher or not, doesn't really, actually makes virtually no theological difference. Right. 6'6" would have been huge. What would you say? Maybe 5'5" might have been the average height.
I think that's been shown either from skeletons or the mummies, even from Egypt.
Yeah. So a 6'6", that's the size of 2 of my sons, by the way.
Oh, okay.
6'6", would make him really a giant among his contemporaries, but well within the realm of human physiology. So very interesting. So fascinating. We'll probably return to your academic interests and your continued work on the Hebrew language. But you dissertate under Gordon on Hebrew Diglossia. And then you defend, and that was obviously successful. And then what happens? Where does one get a job?
Well, this is a great story, and we can bring the Catholic aspect into this. So it's 1979, 80. I defended in February of 80. So basically, I'm finished in 79 or so. And to my good fortune, the SBL, the Society of Biblical Literature, is in New York City that year. Now, I may have traveled to wherever it was anyway, but of course I went. And you're on the job market because you're going to finish within a few months. And amongst the places that I interviewed at the conference was Canisius College, a small Jesuit college in Buffalo. They liked me enough, obviously, to bring me to Canisius for a campus interview, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I was offered the position.
Nice.
And it became my first academic position. Now, I already had some understanding of the Jesuits from a couple of places. First of all, going back to UNC, and I did not mention this, one of my undergraduate teachers was a Jesuit.
Okay. Father
James Devereaux, S.J., was the Shakespeare professor and Renaissance Lit professor in the English department.
Wow.
A few years after I graduated, he left and he went to Georgetown, where he obviously had a much larger Jesuit community,
Sure.
or Catholic community in general, and the Jesuit community, obviously, Georgetown, which he was lacking at UNC. Nice. But I fondly remember Father Devereaux, who really taught me how to read a text, and we'll say something about that as well. When we were reading Shakespeare and Spencer and a few other 16th, 17th century English writers. So I already knew of that persona and background. But also, Cyrus Gordon had published his Ugaritic grammars with the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome.
Yes, that's right.
And had published a lot of articles in the journals Biblica and Orientalia, especially Orientalia, maybe not so much Biblica, which are both published by the PBI in Rome. And Gordon had told me about his dealings with the Jesuits who run the Institute and the publication house. So when I interviewed with Canisius, it was, I was able to speak intelligently about such things coming from a non-Catholic and, in fact, of course, even non-Christian background. Now, to my good fortune, it's 1980, Canisius and maybe almost definitely other Catholic and probably colleges across the board, Canisius was in the process of changing the name of the department from the Theology department to the Department of Religious Studies.
Sure.
Because up until that point, it was basically a department of Catholic studies, Bible, Catholic theology, church history, and so on, patristics, etc. But they had already hired one Protestant person doing New Testament. They had hired somebody to teach Hinduism and South Asian religions. So they were expanding beyond theology, which by definition meant Catholic. And they knew it was now time to hire somebody who could do the Jewish component as well.
Right.
So I was actually the right person at the right place at the right time. So I could do all the Bible.
Right.
The person who was doing Hebrew Bible Old Testament had just retired, so I was able to step into that position, which they were looking to hire, but also could help out in teaching like a Judaism, Christianity, and Islam course, what we would now call Abrahamic religions course. And so it was just wonderful. I will tell you, because we were just talking about Diglossia and so on, at the interview, I do remember one member of the committee saying, well, you have all this great linguistic knowledge of Hebrew. You're not going to be able to teach that here at our small Catholic college in Buffalo. Will you be okay, or something like that? Or, tell us about teaching just Old Testament. And I assured them that I would be fine. I would do my research on my research, but I was fully committed to teaching Intro to Old Testament survey and, a Judaism survey and whatever else was required. And it was a wonderful 6 years. I was there for 6 years. It formed my teaching portfolio. It gave me academic colleagues in New Testament and elsewhere. And I'll just always look back with great fondness, as I still do, on the 6 years I spent with the Jesuits. It was just absolutely wonderful.
Good. And was that is Canisius like a regional university? They're drawing from upstate New York?
Yeah, almost totally.
And mostly Catholic students? Or
90% Catholic
90%,
students. Yeah. The large famous Jesuit institutions such as Boston College and Georgetown and Fordham and the various Loyolas have a national draw. And Canisius, I would think, was probably, almost everybody was from upstate New York, and probably 90% were Catholic. And it was just a wonderful place.
They treated you well.
And they treated me well, and I contributed, and I absolutely loved it.
That's fantastic. Did you ever teach Hebrew there?
There were students who wanted to learn Hebrew, so yes, I did teach Hebrew. I did have the opportunity to teach Hebrew. Yes, I
I'm
did.
not surprised by that, actually.
Yeah, I did.
Periodically, we've offered Hebrew at Franciscan when we've gotten enough students interested.
Right.
And, yeah. Wonderful. So 6 years at Canisius, and then where from there?
So Cornell University was, I was happy to stay. I don't think I was looking to move far away. And of course, I wound up not moving far away. My whole life was in the Northeast, if you include Baltimore in that, but certainly New Jersey and New York, other than my 4 years at UNC, but I still had all of my family. So commitment to family means I wasn't going to apply for a position in California, for example. But when a job opened up at Cornell, one of Cyrus Gordon's other students, sort of half a generation older than I am, David Owen, in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Cornell, he had spent almost his entire academic life there. And we knew each other through the circle because all the Gordon students find each other. It's typical in the academy. If you all share the same mentor, you all find each other, even if you studied at different times and didn't overlap in the classroom. And David Owen encouraged me to apply for the position. And I did, and I got that position.
Yeah. And Cornell has a fairly prestigious Jewish studies program?
It was prestigious, but not of the powerhouse that you would find at Penn or other places. But it was in the Department of Near Eastern Studies where everything was taught from everything, meaning basically Islam and Judaism, Hebrew, Arabic. Eventually, New Testament was taught in that department as well. There's no religion department at Cornell. So there was a religious studies program with which I was affiliated, and a Jewish studies program with which I was affiliated as well. And the good thing about Cornell as well is that they were building a graduate program, so I was able now to start mentoring graduate students as well, from MA and PhD. And during my 18 years there, I had 7 PhD students,
Nice.
one every 2 or 3 years, which was a nice steady flow.
Sure.
And that, of course, put me in an Ivy League university. When you said something about the prestigious Jewish studies, I started smiling because, at Cornell, we have Nobel Prize laden physics and chemistry departments.
Okay.
Right? And
Sure.
Carl Sagan was there in astronomy.
Right.
So it's heavily driven by the sciences. I mean, they're very good in history and English and other humanities fields, but literally Nobel Prize winners walking up and down the corridors in the chemistry and physics building.
Right. So that's a real
And I got to know them, which was just great. So, but that was a wonderful, wonderful 18 years as well.
Yeah.
And it was also, and that's where I got tenure.
Okay.
I left Canisius just before the granting of tenure, and decided to try Cornell, and that also very good sabbatical program allowed me to spend sabbaticals in Israel, and so I was there in '87, and I was there in '91, and then I also had summers going to Israel. There was funds to allow me to do that. And that was a great experience.
Yeah, beautiful. And then from Cornell,
I want to go back a step because this I want to tie something in here with you, which you'll like. So it's the 1980s. So it's right around the time when I'm transitioning from Canisius to Cornell, 1986. And Robert Alter has begun to publish his books, The Art of Biblical Narrative and The Art of Biblical Poetry, 82, 83, 84, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
And then the Tel Aviv University scholar Meir Sternberg publishes his book, Poetics of Biblical Narrative. And Adele Berlin of the University of Maryland publishes her book, Poetics and Interpretation of Biblical Narrative. Now, because David Owen was the editor, Near Eastern editor of the Journal of the American Oriental Society, JAOS, he asked me if I would review together the Sternberg and Berlin books, which I did in a very long review, which was published in JAOS probably around 87, right when I got to Cornell. And I'm telling you this because, as you know, it was a revolution in our field.
Sure.
The literary approach to Bible.
Right.
Now, for somebody like me who had been an English major, even though I had left that maybe, let's say, 10 years earlier when I graduated with my BA, it opened up an entire new world.
Right.
And we'll talk about the redaction of Genesis, which you mentioned in the introduction, which was published right around then, 86.
Okay.
So I'm riding the wave of Robert Alter and now these slightly more recent books of Sternberg and Berlin on how to read the Bible as a literary text. And, we can say something about that for the conversation. And this is what I've said about the field ever since this took over our field in the 80s. The generations prior, Cyrus Gordon, W.F. Albright, going back all the way to S.R. Driver, around 1900, they were asking historians questions. Mm-hmm. Where is Abraham's Ur? When was the Exodus? How many people were in the Exodus? What can we say about the archaeology of Jerusalem or Shechem or any place? They were approaching it because they were approaching it through historicist minds, and those were the kinds of questions they asked. And they didn't think of the biblical text as a literary text. Mm-hmm. They saw it as a window to an ancient world, right, and of course to a theology as well. And were, because they were also fluent in Akkadian, they could do comparisons with Gilgamesh and Enuma Elish and so on. But they never analyzed the material from a literary perspective. And we really needed these new eyes of Robert Alter. And what I have said is that with no new evidence, right? There's no text from Egypt that talks about the Exodus. Abraham hasn't turned up in a cuneiform tablet. Right. There's no monuments from David or Solomon. I mean, we eventually got the Tel Dan inscription. But what I said was that these historicist-oriented questions, you were just spinning your wheels. Mm-hmm. There was nothing new to say. Right. Generation after generation. And this gave us a new perspective. And now biblical scholars started asking a whole new set of questions. How do these texts speak literarily? Uh-huh. And here I have this English training, sure, and I rode that wave. I was on the crest of that wave, right, writing my book, The Redaction of Genesis, which shows the literary artistry of Genesis. Yeah. So it all fit together. And that was my first book, actually. Right. Yeah.
So when I was in my undergraduate work, I had an honors religion class, and this would have been in the late 80s. And we were using Alter's work for biblical narrative, his work on narrative, and then when I was working on Psalms, then we would work on his biblical poetry. And so that was relatively current. Those books had only been out a few years, and they were making an impact at undergraduate level education already. And then when I got to seminary, in my Pentateuch class, well, here's this great work by Gary Rendsburg on the redaction of Genesis. But what you were doing was showing that literary features of the text, which in previous generations had just been parceled out to this source or to that source, which is really not that helpful in understanding the way that the final text that we have really communicates. I mean, once you've said, well, this belongs to P and that belongs to J, what have you done? In a sense, you've just taken apart what the editor or author, or whatever name you want to give to the composer of the text, has done by integrating these. And you were showing that there was a mind, there's a design behind this literary tapestry and things that to a naive reader would look troublesome or even erroneous were actually part of a literary tapestry that was communicated on a very high level. Of course, that was fascinating in its own right. Leads to more useful theological reflection, but produces a greater sense of satisfaction too on the reader, who begins to see, oh yeah, I can see how this is structured. This this is coming together, this is making sense. So that was a real change in our field. Do you think that's continued? I mean, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, because later on in our conversation, I want to talk more specifically about the development of our discipline. But do you think that the altar style, would you include Fishbane in that? Or
Fishbane did some early work in that field as well. I think the one seminal article that he wrote on the Jacob story, which I relied upon heavily in the redaction of Genesis. But at that point, Fishbane then went off and started doing other things on Midrash more, I think, and so on.
Yeah. But in a sense, his study of allusion, I mean, in biblical interpretation in ancient Israel, that is one literary technique, is to allude to older authoritative texts, and that kind of brought that to the forefront of the field. But has that continued, or have we had a kind of a regression back to source criticism and...
Well, I love that expression, a regression back to source criticism. Let's be subjective about it. I would agree with you on that. Right. So we have source criticism is still alive and well in certain circles, certainly in Europe, but I think still in America as well. And the literary perspective holds sway, especially in Israel and amongst scholars in America. Very few in Europe do that. Jan Folkelman would be the other person whom we should mention here, of the Netherlands, who started writing his books in the 70s and 80s, and he deserves a lot of credit for directing our attention to that aspect of biblical literature, working first on Genesis in a relatively small book, and then a massive 4-volume work on Samuel. So let me just say the following. Shall we talk about source criticism a little bit? And,
let's hold off. I want to finish your kind of life trajectory.
Oh, okay, fine. We'll come back to it.
So the Cornell years, and you had opportunity, and then from Cornell to Rutgers. So
2003. I've been at the move happened in 2004, but the interview happened in 2003. And I was approaching 50, and knowing the way most people work in our field, you have one major move left in your career, perhaps. So I said, I was not going to move to, California or far away, but I did note that Rutgers had been expanding its Jewish studies program and department. And this was probably 8 miles from where I grew up and where my parents were still living. And my parents were not getting any younger, and they were getting quite old. They were in their 70s, I should say, quite old. But they were actually already in their early 80s. And I thought it would be just the most wonderful opportunity to be close to them, both for them and for myself. My brother was always geographically further away in North Carolina. By coincidence, he was in North Carolina. So even when I was in central New York, I was still, closer to New Jersey than he was. And I saw that Rutgers was developing its program, and one of what everybody says about Ithaca, maybe Steubenville as well, the best part about Ithaca is the worst part about Ithaca. It's idyllic, it's quiet, it's peaceful, and it's in the middle of nowhere. Right? I mean, you're only an hour from Pittsburgh, actually. Ithaca is 4 hours from any big city.
Really? Wow.
4 hours to New York, 4 hours to Toronto, 4 hours to Montreal, 4 hours to Philadelphia. Wow. So I thought it would be good. I would get back into the New York area, and my children were already in college, one in Philadelphia, one in New York. So the third one was still at home. So it was a great opportunity, and I was just elated to get the job. And of course, it was a gift to my parents, and it was also a gift for me to be close to my parents and be with them until they passed. They lived well into their upper 80s. So that was a great
so personal
move.
Reasons.
Pardon?
Yeah. So personal reasons were big.
But also professional reasons.
Sure. Yeah.
People did ask me, why did you give up an Ivy League school for a top-tier state university, but nevertheless, it's doesn't rank. Rutgers as a university doesn't rank with Cornell. And what I said was, on the level of Jewish studies in particular, it actually outranks Cornell.
Wow.
And really has a wonderful department. And I've been part of that now for 21 years.
Yeah, fantastic. Beautiful.
And also gave me opportunities between, New York, Philadelphia, a little bit further along the corridor between Boston and Washington. And
right.
So it's just been a wonderful 2 decades plus now.
Yeah. Now, a couple big questions about your curriculum vitae and your experience as a scholar of religious texts, et cetera, and so on. So one thing is there can be an animosity towards religious practice that's entrenched in various positions in in higher education in Scripture. So. But it sounds like you didn't run into that. It sounds like the mentors and the teachers that you had in your journey up were all people who respected religious practice and respected the text and did not feel that kind of tension. Is that true?
That is 100% correct. And it is something that I take very, very seriously. I have students who come from all different religious traditions. Jews and Christians will be especially interested in taking Bible, but we live in a very multicultural world today. And by the way, New Jersey is probably the most multicultural state.
Yeah.
California to some extent, but California is the size of a good European-sized country, right? 50 million people. But New Jersey has the largest concentration of Hindu, Indian Americans, and other South Asians. Half a mile from where I live is the Jain Center of New Jersey, and we have a large Muslim population. The Islamic Center isn't too far from where I live either. So in addition to New Jersey's hyphenated Americans that have always been there, Italian Americans and so on. So we have this great multicultural population, and we are the state university, so we attract them all. And these students come and take my classes, and it's just absolutely wonderful.
Sure.
To be able to teach Bible, Jewish history, Dead Sea Scrolls to bright young people who come from different religious backgrounds and have them all in the same classroom.
Yeah.
And we respect all of them, and we don't delve into personal religious practices and so on. They know I'm Jewish. I cancel class on the Jewish holidays. But it makes for a really interesting class. And we'll play off of each other's knowledges, of course.
Sure.
Yeah.
So it's so you're cognizant and aware of the existential importance of these texts for so many different students and scholars and so on. But there's you don't feel like there's a conflict between higher learning and the pursuit of truth and intellectual growth, and also having personal convictions.
You just said the right phrases. In pursuit of knowledge and this is why we do what we do.
Right.
This is why you and I teach.
Yeah.
This is why our students come to the university. We want to open their minds. And they do open our minds as well.
Right.
And we want to have that dialogue, and we want to have that engagement. And I asked the students, all I want you to do, just come with an open mind. If you've come from a very traditional religious background where you think you've learned it all, I want you to come and open your mind. If you come from some tradition that is less religious or not religious, you're reading a classic. Just, you wouldn't bring an edge to reading Homer.
Yeah.
Why would you bring an edge to reading this? Right? This is one of the greatest achievements of humanity, this collection of biblical books that we teach. And it has, in addition to that, at a secular institution, we don't engage necessarily in the, sort of the personal spiritual levels, but I only ask the students, join me in a journey and go back 3,000 years from ago and and I want to take you to ancient Israel and be in the mindset of people who believed that this was the one God who created a covenant with the people of Israel, who created the world, And this is what people believe. Whether you believe it today or not, or you have some more modernist view or non-view,
Sure. Just appreciate the perspective.
Appreciate what's going on here.
Yeah. That leads well into another question I wanted to ask you, and that is, how would you defend the value of studying these ancient texts today in the modern era? Are they not just a bunch of Bronze Age myths, that lead us backwards in human development, et cetera? And you've doubtless heard all of the critiques and criticisms there, and yet you are teaching at a secular university. You're teaching largely sacred texts. How does one defend that within the ecosystem of the university and its value for pedagogy for young people today?
These texts, I would say the following. When you know this implicitly, and I know it implicitly, but we also have to say it explicitly. These texts, let's leave the divine aside for the moment.
Sure.
They are so human. Mm-hmm. They are unbelievably human. The relationships, the pathos, the stories.
Without doubt.
Just absorb that, and if it can speak to you in some way, even better. Right? And admire the narrative art. Think about what these words mean. Right? Mm-hmm. So this is why we read. And if it's no different to you than reading Shakespeare, bring what you bring to your Shakespeare class. You're reading Bible. Right? Mm-hmm. For some people, reading Shakespeare is a religious experience as well, and it probably was for me when I was an undergraduate.
Sure.
And there's a benefit to reading all of these
Shakespeare,
texts.
But right, that's a whole other discussion.
There is so much to learn from reading these texts. Right?
Yeah.
And we live in a world which is so fast-paced and is so technological. And I allow my students to bring their devices to the classroom and so on. But slow down for a moment and just consider that 3,000 years ago somebody wrote these words. And it was a relationship between God and humanity. It could be a relationship between human and human.
Right. It
can be whatever you're going to take out of this. And what we were talking about earlier, think about the transmission of that text. Mm-hmm. That 3,000 years later, we're still reading it in Hebrew, right?
Yeah.
And what that means. Just think about that alone.
Right.
No different than people in South Asia are still reading the Vedas from 3,000 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
Think about what it meant to just transmit that we have this in our hands still today.
Yeah. So it connects us with other people around the world. The Old Testament Hebrew Bible is treasured by Jews, Christians, even Islam, so to speak, shows respect to the prophetic tradition and claims that Muhammad is in continuity with that. So that's most of the world's population right there, all the Christians and the Muslims. Right. So that's a huge connection trans-culturally around the world, as well as through depth of time, diachronically. So it's very human to meditate on Scripture. And there's a reason why these texts and not others perhaps have been preserved for all these. So this is Jordan Peterson's argument.
Yeah.
And I have differences with his approach, but he argues, this is these texts are part of the evolution of human culture and have survived in a sense because they are the fittest or have the greatest value. And there's good, and one could critique that a little bit. But anyway.
We actually, one of the things we should state here, again, obvious, but let's just mention it. The Bible, and now I'm talking about the Jewish Bible, Old Testament, these are the only texts from that time period, from that part of the world, which were transmitted to us uninterrupted by a tradition that still holds them dear.
Right.
Which is to say, the same is true about the Greeks and Homer, right? But they're no longer worshiping Zeus and the gods.
Right.
the Mesopotamian and Egyptian and Canaanite literatures all died out and had to be recovered in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Even though those civilizations were so much more powerful at the time.
Right. And
yet their literatures have died.
I mean, Egypt was the power, Assyria was the power, and those civilizations eventually passed. And it goes back to what we were just saying about the scribes, writing this. Right. And I don't think any other tradition is as old as the Jewish and Hindu ones, right? Who actually have an unbroken chain of devotion to sacred texts, and Zoroastrians as well, which would take us back about 3,000 years to the beginning of those traditions.
Wow.
And just contemplating that, any one of these traditions could have died out, and especially the Jewish one because the population is so small, right, and due to the vicissitudes of Jewish history over time.
Sure. Yeah, many seeing that the hand of God preserving the Jewish people. So yeah, beautiful. So that's why we continue to study them. Now, a couple of big questions about your, personal growth, view of the world. Who are 2 or 3 great thinkers that have had the biggest impact on your work? I'm going to mention 2 from the Jewish tradition. I mentioned Martin Buber before. Okay.
And I very much, early on in my studies as an undergraduate, actually both of the people I will mention I read as undergraduates, Martin Buber, who attempted to create a blend of existentialism and Judaism. And his book, I and Thou, is still worth reading, and it's still a classic. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the English title should have been I and You, because in German it's Ich und Du, and if you know right. German, which has a formal and an informal, it's the informal, right? It's the relationship between God and humans. And I thought I always found Buber's work just so penetrating, and it's a relatively short book, and again, because of family history, I know my uncle was studying with him and so on. And the other one is Abraham Joshua Heschel, who actually is a great 20th century Jewish theologian, philosopher-theologian. And his book, The Sabbath, is just a classic. Again, a very narrow, short book.
Okay.
And if I could summarize it in an instant, he refers to the Sabbath as holiness in time, or sanctity in time. Yeah. And he pointed out, and if we study ancient Near Eastern religions, we certainly know this, that in the ancient world, holiness was to be found in places. Mm-hmm. You had a temple, you had a holy mountain, you had a holy river, physical spaces, either natural ones like mountains, or man-built ones like, one of the great temples in Egypt. And his reading of Genesis 1 is Israel breaks with that tradition by creating holiness in time. And in our household, when we light Shabbat candles on Friday night to inaugurate the Sabbath, we know we're entering into that holy sphere of the next 24 hours of having our holy day. Again, going back to a tradition that's 3,000 years old. And Heschel points out, in Hebrew, the word kadosh, the adjectival form or the verb form, either way, that the first time it's used in the Bible is at the very beginning of Genesis chapter 2, when God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. The second time it's used in the Bible is Exodus 19, where the people of Israel is called a goy kadosh, a holy nation. And the third time it's used in the Bible is when the tabernacle gets constructed, starting in Exodus 25. The Hebrew word is mikdash, meaning a holy place.
Right.
And Heschel points out, it's been a while since I read Heschel, but I think I'm citing him correctly here, that primary holiness in the Jewish tradition is in time. Secondary holiness is the people of Israel. And the physical space of the tabernacle, and eventually the temple, is only tertiary holiness.
Interesting.
Looking at where the word is used in a macroscopic view of the biblical text.
Right.
And it also explains why Judaism was able to survive the destruction of the first temple and, in fact, the destruction of the second temple. I don't
those
know
are
enough.
spaces which are tertiary, but
Right.
time is primary.
I don't know enough about Akkadian Babylonian religion, right? But when the temple of Marduk got destroyed, or the temple of this city got destroyed, and we have laments of these cities from in cuneiform literature, eventually those religious traditions died out,
Right.
because there was no other place to go. So this is just something that permeates our personal, family, cultural, religious lives in our home and in our community. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and that's very poignant for us as Catholics, because 2025 is a Jubilee year.
Oh, right.
And which has caused a lot of reflection. I just wrote a book, Jesus and the Jubilee, reflecting on the Mosaic liturgy set up on the sabbatical cycle of the sanctification of time. And the Jubilee is kind of the capstone of a sabbatical system whose foundation is the weekly Sabbath. And so when for those of us at the center, especially my colleague, Dr. Scott Hahn, we've been doing a lot of talking about sacred time. And Dr. Hahn, in fact, has been talking a lot about specifically the Sabbath and quoting Heschel on a number of occasions. And I think I am correct that Heschel is quoted also by St. John Paul II in his encyclical Dies Domini, the Day of the Lord, which is the Christian Sabbath on Sunday. But I believe he quotes Heschel there with appreciation of understanding this concept of the sanctification of time.
And it's become even more important, I have to say, on a personal level. We live with our devices.
Right.
We live with them, right?
Yeah.
And the Sabbath, the way it's observed in a traditional Jewish home, is you put all that aside.
Yeah, that's
turn
beautiful.
them off for 24 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
you do what we used to do. We eat meals together. We talk. We read.
Yeah.
We don't browse.
Yeah. The Vatican during 2025 is granting an indulgence. We don't need to get into talking about an indulgence is, but they are granting an indulgence for those who fast from all media for 24 hours. Yeah. This is kind of what
part of the same tradition.
About. Yeah,
right.
Exactly. It's beautiful.
So, yeah. Great.
That's great. One of the two more things I want to talk about before we kind of move on to the history of biblical scholarship. But you kind of touched on this already. You mentioned two thinkers, Martin Buber and Abram Joshua Heschel, and you mentioned two of their books, I and Thou and The Sabbath. Any other books in your top five?
Well, if we stay with Heschel for a moment, his much larger philosophical theological work is called God in Search of Man.
Okay.
And it's a fantastic title. It turns what we usually think of on its head.
Right.
Because we're usually thinking of man in search of God, right? We're all searchers, we're all seekers, we're all looking for the divine, we're all looking for the religious truth.
Right.
But for Heschel, it's God in search of man.
Beautiful.
God is looking for his partner.
Yeah. Wonderful.
And that just speaks, the title alone speaks volumes.
Right.
Yeah. So
that would make your top five.
Yeah, though that's three.
You got two more.
Well, the biblical studies or just
just your personal life.
Yeah.
For me, Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning is definitely one of my maybe top one or two.
And of course, Frankl brings us back to a Holocaust survivor, and the meaning of life and so on. It's actually one of my wife's top two.
Besides Scripture itself, that's one of might be my number one most impactful book in my life.
And I just have to admit, it's been a long time since I've read it.
Yeah.
But I would put in that list of five Walden by Henry David Thoreau.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
And it's actually a little bit. It's very much what we're talking about is related in the sense that he takes himself away and he goes to nature. Right. That was the name of his other book, was Nature. Where was Nature by Emerson? And Nature was by Emerson. Emerson wrote Nature. Thoreau wrote Walden. And the two together really give us a perspective on how we should be approaching our life and our world. My wife and I are major environmentalists. We love nature. We go out into nature. And so on the poetic level, I would bring Wordsworth into this, who just left it all behind and went to live in the Lake District, and taught us to appreciate nature in the years of what Blake was calling the Satanic Mills, of the Industrial Revolution. And we have a greater need for that today than we've ever had before, given the fast pace and everything else that we see around us. So I would add those to the pantheon of writers and their books that I love and cherish.
Yeah, absolutely. Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, 100%. Okay, well, why don't we transition to talking a little bit about the history of our field?
Yeah.
And this is such a pleasure for me to have you, because you're kind of in living touch with some of the greats of our field, Cyrus Gordon being, one of the giants of American biblical scholarship. Who else would be? Certainly William Foxwell Albright would be another giant. And it's been pointed out that many American scripture scholars can trace their pedigree back to Albright. And I would be an example.
You would be one of them. Right?
Yeah, James Vanderkam, my Dr. Fodder, was trained by Frank Moore Cross, and Cross, if I'm correct, dissertated under Albright.
Right.
And there's many. Who are kind of the fathers of American biblical scholarship besides Albright and Gordon's pedigree and his? You just mentioned Gordon's students. It's kind of a family, as it were,
right?
Of those that he mentored. Are there any others besides Gordon and Albright?
In America, it would be really hard to find people who didn't study with Gordon or Albright, right? I mean, in Near Eastern studies, more generally, you have the whole Chicago group, the University of Chicago, but they're really the people who, especially doing cuneiform studies, the great center there. I would be hard-pressed to find another good example of somebody, and with Albright, it really is, especially through Cross at Harvard, right?
Right.
Because Albright had many, many students, and some of them did produce doctoral students, but it was mainly Cross's position at Harvard that carried on the Albright tradition, which produced so many PhD students. So I don't know that there's really another
competitor, as it were.
There's nobody who comes to the level of the two of them. There was the school at Penn where you had Spicer and Kramer. But again, I think there was more cuneiform studies more than Bible per se.
More technical, ancient Near East.
Yeah. But I can certainly talk about the British and Israeli scenes, which I know well, because in Britain I was always a great admirer of John Emerton at Cambridge.
And he guided a lot of students over the years.
Including people who are still very much in the field, whom you and I know either personally or, and so, Hugh Williamson, Robert Gordon, I think Graham Davies, John Day, I think they were all Emerton students.
No kidding.
Yeah, I'm
Interesting.
pretty sure.
It's a huge impact.
Yeah. And Israel, of course, has the highest concentration in a small place of biblical scholars. But the sort of the giant amongst all of those, who was more of a field archaeologist, was Benjamin Mazar, whom I was privileged to know in the later years of his life. I think he died. I know exactly when he died, 1994, which I can tell a great.
What about Yehezkel Kaufman?
Yes, Kaufman as well. I mean, he's a little bit older.
Right.
Kaufman was deceased. I think he died in the 60s. I don't know how many students he produced. His influence was great.
Right. Is it still felt in Israel? Or is it kind of passed?
I think it is, but in certain circles. I think so, yeah. Especially on his earlier dating of the priestly school. Yeah. I think that impact is still there. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so these were, I knew Emerton not well, but he was the editor of the leading journal in our field, Vetus Testamentum, for so long, in which I published many of my early articles. That I have a nice file of correspondence, which I will, which I still cherish. I should open it up more often and have a look and see what he wrote to me.
Right. Yeah.
And then we would meet frequently in Jerusalem, actually, where he spent a lot of time.
Oh, did he?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
He had like a little second home at St. George's, the Anglican center
nice.
in Jerusalem. Yeah.
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 Let me back up a little bit here and talk about biblical studies and pose a kind of existential scenario that will get us into the history of our field in the past 200 years or so. And that's the not uncommon phenomena that some undergraduate student takes an interest in their faith tradition, whether they're Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, maybe has some kind of religious experience, et cetera, gets excited and thinks, well, I'll sign up for a religion class.
Right.
So they take Religion 101 at such and such state university. They go in, and over the course of the semester, they find out that nobody wrote any biblical book that was attributed to them, and Moses never existed, and everything was concocted by those dastardly priests in the 5th century or something like this. And the poor kid, doesn't know if he believes that there's a God, by December. So how on earth did that cultural phenomena come about?
Well, they don't get that in my class.
I'm sure they don't, or mine either. But
right, and I know they don't in yours. I wish I had ready answers for this. Mm-hmm. I mean, did any other field get subverted like our field did by the documentary hypothesis, which is really baseless?
Yeah.
And we're still fighting it, really on 140 or so, 150 years now since Wellhausen.
Right.
I just finished reading a great book called Murmuring Against Moses by John Bergsma and Jeff Morrow, which really does a superb job in tracing the field and the history of the field and where we are and how we got here. I think the experience that you're mentioning probably does occur of the undergraduate, the 18 or 20-year-old who's doing that. It doesn't happen in my classroom, and
right.
I, like we've been talking about, try to impress upon the students the absolute, essence of the biblical material. Mm-hmm. I don't understand how people continue to teach this. I really don't. It's absolutely mind-boggling to me.
Yeah.
As Cyrus Gordon, I believe, once said, they have greater faith in the documentary hypothesis than they do in the Bible.
Oh yeah, without doubt.
I think those were his words.
Yeah.
This might be.
He was not a fan of traditional source criticism.
No, not at all.
And what was Gordon's critique of the documentary, which for our viewers should clarify, this is this approach to the Pentateuch that divides it typically into 4 major sources known by the letters J, E, D, and P, and at least traditionally assigns them different dates in the history of Israel. And Gordon was an early critic of this approach. And why did he not? But it was so popular when he was receiving his education, and yet he kind of went against the tide with that. And why was that?
He never, with one or two exceptions, he never really published in any major way against the documentary hypothesis, but it just permeated the classroom for sure and permeated his overall approach. The one thing that he would speak of, both in class and in his publications, was the different divine names. And it came from reading Ugaritic literature. So for those who are watching who are not aware, Cyrus Gordon was one of the pathfinders in the field of Ugaritic studies. He wrote the basic grammar and the basic dictionary and produced a translation of all the myths and epics and some of the other texts as well. And he pointed out, absolutely, of course, as you and I know, that in the Baal myth, in one line he's called Baal, and in the next line he's called Hadad. And you have different names and different, that's the most famous example, but you have different names and different epithets for the same deity, not only in the Ugaritic material, which comes out of the greater world of Canaan, but also in the Akkadian material and in the Egyptian material. So if you read Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, where Marduk is the major figure, he's also called Adad there, in addition to Marduk. And so it makes no sense to just take, we're going to have a B and an H source, a Baal source and a Hadad source that made it into the Baal myth, that the biblical author, same person, could use Yahweh in one passage and Elohim in the next passage. Yeah. We've never sorted out, is there a pattern as to why Yahweh and why Elohim at times? Cassuto wrote a seminal book on the subject, or a chapter in the book. I don't know if he proved the point. I don't think he did. I don't think it's been proven yet. I don't have a ready answer as to why one is used over the other.
Right.
But I have seen some examples where I think Yahweh does play a role versus Elohim.
Sure.
As I know we'll get to my writing a commentary on Samuel. I've seen a few examples in Samuel where I think it matters. But I'm not willing to say that we have separate sources. So that was Gordon's biggest critique. By the way, he wrote a short article. Many of Gordon's articles were very short. He wrote very pithy, in a very pithy style. He wrote an article called Higher Critics and Forbidden Fruit. I don't know if you know that little piece.
I've heard of it, yeah.
And it's 5-6 pages. And it's one of the few places where he directly attacks the JEDP theory. And he published it in Christianity Today. And he told me that
which is an evangelical Protestant publication.
Yeah, right. And after this is the 1950s or 60s, I think.
Sure.
And he told me years later, of course, when I was a student, or after that James Pritchard, another major figure in our field of that generation, said to him, when I use the word they now, they meaning all the other scholars who subscribe to the documentary hypothesis, Pritchard said to Gordon something like, they're not upset with what you said, because I think deep down they know you're right. They're upset with where you said it. Right? Like, put it in the Journal of Biblical Literature or someplace where it gets vetted by our field or something like that.
Right.
But it was that comment by Pritchard discloses quite a bit, because do the subscribers to the theory really believe that these are these separate sources? If I may, let me give 2 examples, one minor, one major. Of how the whole theory just collapses unto itself. The first 2 are interrelated, and then I'll do the major one. So these are familiar stories. Everybody knows these stories. Jacob deceives Isaac, and Rebekah is, of course, the main instigator, the one who hatched the plot. And she tells Jacob, after everything calms down and Esau's wrath hasn't calmed down yet, go flee and go live with my brother Laban for a few days. And she uses the expression in Hebrew, yamim achadim, a few days. That's at the end of chapter 27. Well, everybody knows the story. Chapter 29, he comes to the land of Aram, and he meets Rachel at the well. And he decides to live with Laban, and 7 years go by, and it says in the biblical text that the 7 years, it's the most romantic passage in the Bible, the 7 years, it's in one verse, 7 years are narrated in one verse, and the 7 years passed in his eyes as but a few days, such was his love for Rachel. Right. That's the same Hebrew phrase, yamim achadim. You hear it in 27 and you hear it in chapter 29. They are separated out in the source critique.
As 2 different sources.
As 2 different sources. And so you're supposed to learn, the attentive reader will learn that the few days turns into 7 years actually, which actually turns into 20 years, because 7 more and then 6 more before he returns to the land of Canaan. And this has theological ramifications. When God wants to punish people, God can punish them instantaneously, as when he strikes down Er and Onan, the first two sons of Judah, in chapter 38. In this case, Jacob is being punished for the immoral act of deceiving his aged blind father and co-opting the blessing from Esau. But how much more wonderful it is when it's all played out in a human drama. And then it's all tied in here together. When Laban now deceives him by switching Leah and Rachel, when he wakes up in the morning, Jacob says to Laban, "Why did you deceive me?" Well, it's the same deceit that we just... And Laban says to him, "It is not done so in our place to place the younger before the firstborn." Which is his comeuppance for what he did. It's like, I know what you did back there in Canaan,
it's poetic justice.
In my sister's house, poetic justice.
Yeah.
So it's this constant interplay. And then Jacob is deceived yet again by his sons when they pretend that Joseph has died.
Oh, yeah.
And the ringleader of that deception, Judah, is in turn, in the very next chapter, deceived by his daughter-in-law, Tamar.
Oh, yeah.
All of these deceptions have the same props. Clothing and a goat. Right? Jacob puts the goat skins on his arms, and he puts Esau's clothing on in order to deceive.
Right.
His sons deceive him by taking Joseph's coat, his garment, dipping it in the blood of a goat. And then Judah is in turn deceived by Tamar, who dresses with her widow's veil. No, takes off her widow's veil and dresses as a prostitute, and then promises the goat. He promises the goat as the security for their rendezvous.
Right.
So if you read the JDP theory, well, you can bracket D on this one. If you take Genesis and divide it up into the sources, J, E, and P, you're missing the deceiver-deceived thread that goes through the whole thing and the few days that goes through the whole story.
Yeah.
And what is it? It all happened by some random redactor bringing it all together.
Oh, yeah.
It cannot be.
Yeah.
It has to be read in a unified way.
Right.
And there's a beauty to that theology, and there's one footnote to that, and I haven't even gotten to my major one yet, which is, and the text is silent on this, and this is the beauty of it. When Jacob returns to the land of Canaan, he reunites, we're in chapter 32, 33, he reunites with his brother Esau. They make up, they hug, they kiss, and they're both present to bury their father Isaac when he dies.
Right.
Where's Rebekah? Rebekah has been written out of the story. After she sends Jacob off, you never hear from her again. And the implication is that Rebekah must have died in the intervening 20 years. Genesis records the deaths of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the primary wives, Sarah and Rachel. But it never records the death of Rebekah.
Interesting.
And it's through that silence. And again, you can only appreciate this on a macro scale. And there are no, to use a good Catholic term, there's no systematic theology in ancient Israel. There's no book of morals or ethics. You learn your morality, your ethics, your religious tradition through story, which is what the Torah does. And you're supposed to learn, don't act like Rebekah. Don't take advantage of the blind. Don't act like Jacob. Don't take advantage of your hungry brother and so on and so forth.
So it's narrative theology.
And narrative, I love that term, narrative theology. This is how you do it.
Right.
Didn't Gordon Wenham write a book called Torah as Story? I think
Yeah,
so.
yes. Others have. Certainly. A Sailhammer. The Pentateuch as narrative.
Right. My macro, if I may be permitted, macro one is the first two creation stories. Now, I'm not here to say that everything coheres perfectly. There are hiccups in the text.
Sure.
How many animals did Noah take on board the ark? What were the names of Esau's wives?
Yeah.
Who took Joseph down to Egypt, right? Midianites, Ishmaelites, etc. So I'm not going to sweep those under the rug. I don't want to get rid of them. They're there. The tradition has held on to them. No scribes got rid of them. They are precious. I would call them variant traditions or something like that, both of which were seen as sacred enough to be embedded into the biblical text. Okay, fine. And ditto for the two creation stories. So there's no way to, to dovetail the two. I mean, the order of creation, the method of creation, in the first story, male and female together. In the second story, male first and then female. But this is my understanding of the two creation stories. Now, the first one is supposedly from the priestly source, and the second one is from the Yahweh source. But if you look at them microscopically, fine. But let's look at them macroscopically. What is the book of Genesis doing? The first story has what I call a cosmocentric view, the entire cosmos, right? Not only humans and animals and plant life, but the sun and the moon and the stars and the sky and the earth and everything.
Right.
The second story is anthropocentric. We've got the first human. The verbs are different. In the first story, we have this specialized verb bara for creation, which is predicated only of God in biblical Hebrew. And in the second story, when God does things, there are human verbs. Yotzer creates man. That's the same word that's used for a potter,
right? Because
you're using clay. Nata, he plants a garden. That's the same verb that you would have when a human plants a plant or a garden. And then boneh, for build, he builds Eve out of Adam's rib or Adam's flank. Those are basic verbs that can be predicated. It's much more anthropocentric, and the man has a job. Till the garden, name the animals, right? Okay. Take those two stories, put them together, and you have biblical theology. If everything takes place in heaven, if it's all cosmocentric, you don't have you don't have the biblical story. If it's all anthropocentric here on earth, and you don't have the divine, you don't have a biblical story. It is the exposition or the prelude for what will be the covenantal relationship or the relationship between God and humanity, even before there's a people of Israel, of course. That to me is what that's how you have to read Genesis 1 and 2, not separating them out.
Oh yeah, no. With the editor, composer, whatever name you want to give to the author of the text, has purposely brought them together to be read in a complementary fashion.
Absolutely.
And one of the ironies I see is that Genesis 2 is typically attributed to J, Genesis 1 to the priestly source, yet it's in Genesis 2 that you get mention of the Gihon, which is so significant to the Temple Mount later on. It's in Genesis 2 that the man is put in the garden to Avad and Shamar, which later in Numbers you have the priestly tribe or the clerical tribe of Levi, as well as the sons of Aaron being commanded to Avad, the Avadah, and to Shamar, the Mishmereth, to work the work and to guard the guardianship. And I think Gordon Wenham points this out,
Beautiful. And the cherubim.
The cherubim.
Which are a priestly thing.
Which are priestly.
Tabernacle.
The tselah, that you just mentioned, the flank, that's used only in temple building, almost exclusively in temple building narratives. So what, all the so-called J narrative has all these even linguistic connections with texts that would be considered priestly. Throughout the rest of the Pentateuch and even other parts of the Bible.
I want to make it clear, by the way, that I do accept the obvious, which is that there is a priestly school, I'll call it, and a Deuteronomic school.
Oh, yeah.
That the P of Leviticus and the D of Deuteronomy and the legal cultic ritual are clearly different. That's the only element that I would accept, and it's so obvious that it's just part of the text and the truth that we have. But when the documentary hypothesis goes wild by ascribing a half verse to P, this story to P, this half story to J, this piece over here to E, it's just nonsensical. And good to circle back to Gordon, That's exactly what he understood by looking at these ancient Near Eastern stories. He understood this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to summarize what we've been discussing, these different features of the text that in previous generations and still today are used by scholars to divide the narrative into different sources. And then kind of the underlying assumption seems to always have been that some literary klutz of a redactor came along and tossed them all together without noticing the tensions, and thus we have this, nonsensical text before us. And you've been following a tradition from your mentor, Gordon, that says no. First of all, the sometimes disconcerting features of these texts, at least to modern readers, first of all, very similar to literary features that we find in other ancient Near Eastern texts, the Baal right. epic, and so on. So that's one point to be made. Secondly, if we look deeper at these the literary features of the text, we start to observe a very sophisticated literary artistry that is using hook words and allusion and other kinds of wordplay to create a tapestry that has theological significance. And most importantly, that tapestry and that web of literary interconnection is lost if we pursue this methodology of trying to divide it all up into the sources, and you kind of miss the beauty of what's taking place before us. Is that kind of accurate?
Absolutely encapsulates it very, very nicely, John. And you miss the artistic beauty of the text. And as I'm trying to explain, you miss the religious teachings and the
right.
theology behind the text.
Right.
And you're left with nothing.
Yeah.
Which is why by December, the student whom you've described is left
right.
with nothing.
Right, yeah. And I think in a sense that was intentional, because I think that certain figures in the history of our field, as we point out in Murmuring Against Moses and other works that have come out of the St. Paul Center, and we're not the only ones who pointed this out, but there was a desire to kind of disestablish the influence of Christianity, in some cases also Judaism, within the culture by problematizing the reading of the sacred text. Mm-hmm. And within Judaism, I see this going back to Spinoza,
right.
and he had some personal issues with the Jewish community in Amsterdam.
Right.
And with Julius Wellhausen, whom you mentioned, Moshe Weinfeld, another great giant of our field, has at least one article where I think it was his article on the documentary hypothesis after 100 years. And I think he worked that up into a book before the end of his life, where he pointed out kind of an anti-Semitic edge to Wellhausen. I just read the whole Prolegomena about 3 years ago, I think. I was like, I should just go back and just read the whole darn thing. I've only read bits and pieces in my formation, just read the whole thing. What struck me was Wellhausen's edge against the church.
Absolutely. The Catholic Church.
Yeah. I mean, because that's what,
right.
the church, because the Protestant church in Germany was under the thumb of the state.
Yeah.
And the independent church is the Catholic Church. And he uses the term Kirche about 100 times in the Prolegomena. And it's true, he's got an anti-Semitic thing going on. But what he doesn't like about Judaism is he keeps referring to it as the church of the Old Testament, or the church of antiquity. And he saw the priestly source and then later Pharisaic Judaism as a precursor of Catholicism. And it's really Catholicism that he doesn't like,
right? Yeah.
And because he regards the Jewish tradition as and why Judaism and Catholicism, because we both have liturgy, we both have canon law in a sense, we both have religious
right.
law, and so from the German Protestant, and then kind of like even post-Protestants, because he's really in the period of Protestant liberalism. By that period, like that's all too rigid, that's all too structured. That's the shackles on humanity, and we got to liberate. So there was a kind of a desire to, I think, undermine the text by reducing it to these sources that can't, we're going to crack Humpty Dumpty so he can't be put back together again, and that will have some social and political consequences that we like.
What I do when I teach the theory, by the way, I teach the theory because I think the students need to know it.
I do too, yeah.
And then I don't spend a lot of time on it. I used to use a textbook that actually was based on the theory, and I had to teach it and then told them why it was all wrong. I stopped using that textbook, but I was using it for other reasons. But in any case, because it was very good otherwise. And I think the important thing to point out here, I wasn't the first to say this, I'm sure I learned it from somebody else, is that by dating, especially by dating D and P to the 7th and 6th or 5th centuries,
right,
they are later than the classical prophets.
Right.
So J and E are just very lovely stories about Abraham and Jacob and Joseph and so on, fine, okay. As if they're just nice stories, which they are. And they can be, according to Wellhausen, 10th and 9th century, let's say. Then comes the 8th century prophets, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah, in that order, who create the greatest religious spirit of ancient Israel. And then only after that do you get D and P. D is mainly law,
right,
and P is mainly ritual and cult.
Right.
And he saw in D the Jews who still abide by the law,
right,
and he saw in P the Catholics who still do nonsense like altars and incense and priesthood. Am I right?
Yes. Absolutely.
So they have to be the the sort of the downward spiral away from the great prophetic tradition, which is carried on by Lutherans, etc.
Right. Lutherans, European Protestants, yeah. Oh, I agree with you 100% on that. Right. It's kind of a reading of the religious landscape of 19th century Europe back into the.
It tells you much more about 19th century Europe, Germany, Central Europe, than it says anything about ancient Israel.
Right.
And the irony is, and I just was reading somebody about this recently. I don't remember who it was, unless it was in your book. The irony is that exactly when he's writing is when the great cuneiform material is all being discovered.
Oh, yeah.
That the Enuma Elish and the Gilgamesh epic are all being published in the 1870s and so on. And this is when, and he is ignoring all of it.
Right. Yeah.
Total ignorance.
Right. So we're not getting that comparative literary perspective.
And even though he was a fine Arabist and
was.
had, I mean, that's an understatement, superb Arabist and had a full control of the entirety of Islamic literature, he didn't really do the comparative there, and he certainly didn't turn a blind eye to all the great discoveries coming out of Iraq at the time.
Yeah. And nonetheless, his theory has held sway and still is around in various forms. Let's talk about that for a moment. Have you ever encountered the Neo-Documentarian Movement now, coming out of Chicago and elsewhere?
Yeah, well, I still don't quite understand what's the neo part of the Neo-Documentarians. The Neo-Documentarians implies that it actually, was it waiting and now it's back? Is that why it's
I don't know.
People are using that term, and I'm not sure why. Why don't we just call them documentarians? I know the individuals involved. I don't know them well. I basically just ignore the scholarship. Okay. I just ignore it. And I continue to produce my own scholarship the way I proceed. By the way, the other thing we can talk about, I mean, there's the sources which divide them up to our minds, unnecessarily. But there's also the linguistic evidence, and we bring that back in.
Right.
The linguistic profile of all these stories is earlier rather than later.
Yes.
And yet, along with the Neo-Documentarians are the radical ones, especially in Germany, it seems, who are dating more and more of this material to not just the 5th century, but even the 4th century, which flies in the face of linguistic evidence, right? There's no late biblical Hebrew here. You don't see Persian loanwords, all the things you would see if you opened up Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and so on. the whole
even the political and theological concerns are anachronistic in the fifth, fourth, third centuries. Yeah,
you've done such a wonderful job over the years in pointing out the lack of any mention of Zion or Jerusalem in the Pentateuch.
How does that fit the agenda of the 5th century?
If you open up any book from the 8th, 7th, 6th, 5th, that's all they're talking about.
Right, right.
And it just doesn't fit. This is a great place to give you another one of Cyrus Gordon's great statements. He was too gentlemanly and too polite to call another scholar wrong. He divided the world of scholars into two groups, those who catch on fast and those who need more time. So we are in the former group. Unfortunately, there's still a whole bunch of people out there in that latter group.
Yeah, what a graciousness about that. It's a beautiful thing, because he was a beautiful human being as well as a great scholar. He had a gentleness about him and refrained from some of the caustic recriminations that sometimes characterize our field. Yeah. That's a good place to segue into, and this relates to what we've talked about already, that biblical studies is very much embedded in social movements, as well as personal interests, as well as the personalities of those who shape the field, what their concerns are, what their experience has been. And that's one of the things I try to show through this show, as done by Scripture, is how the Scriptures are part of our lives, and biblical scholarship too is influenced by very personal existential factors. You've been privileged, we've talked about this already, to work with some of the greats, Gordon being a big one that we've talked about a little bit more. I'd like to give you a chance to tell us a little bit more about Cyrus Gordon as a person, and any sparkling anecdotes, as it were, that you might want to share. You've already shared a bunch, maybe you've used up your best ones. And then some of the other figures in the field, like Benjamin Mazar.
Yeah, Mazar, I have a wonderful story I'd like to relate. I don't know, Gordon was just, he was just unique. He was just such a wonderful person. I'm so glad that I was able to spend such a formative time of my own scholarly career with him and learn so much from him. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Benjamin Mazar was a contemporary of Gordon, maybe slightly older, and born in Germany. For the viewers who don't know, the Hebrew University was founded in 1925, before the State of Israel was founded, and it was populated by a large number, especially German Jewish professors in all fields, sciences, our field, and so on, who started moving to Israel in the 1920s, and of course after 1933, a very large migration, including my own family members, and so many of the greats of our field were born in Germany. Shmaryahu Talmon, Abraham Malamati was from Austria, actually, who all made their way to the Hebrew University. Joshua Blau in the field of Hebrew language, born in Hungary, but was studying in Vienna. So, but Mazar was the great archaeologist who excavated so many sites, including in Jerusalem. And so I had a sabbatical in 1993. I show up in Jerusalem in August of 93 to spend the fall semester there. That summer was when the House of David Tel Dan inscription was found, in the summer of 93.
Say a little bit about the significance of that. I remember this. I was in seminary at the time.
This was all the excitement.
And up until that point, biblical minimalism was like a steam locomotive. Right. And this is a major bump in the tracks.
So you just used the word minimalism, which we haven't used yet, but you're right. So the historians like Albright, Gordon, and so many others, even if they didn't have the evidence for an Abraham or a patriarchal age or a Moses or a David, they certainly knew and or believed that these were that these things actually happened. But after a century of excavations and so on, and there was no any information about this, which we mentioned, the biblical minimalists arose in places like Sheffield and Copenhagen especially, who were saying that the whole thing is just, as you said before, myths written up in the 5th century, centuries after, to create, if I understood minimalism, I mean, that's one thing, just to say that. But the other thing they said was to create a glorious past for an Israel that never existed.
Okay.
Right?
Sure.
I am not one to see an anti-Semite lurking on every corner, but there were colleagues, especially Anson Rainey, to some extent Bill Deaver, who pointed out the anti-Semitic viewpoint here. It denudes Israel, the Jewish people, of its history.
Right.
So in 1993, Avraham Biran of Hebrew Union College, Jerusalem, by the way, I think he was in at least his 70s, if not his 80s at that point. He was still going out into the field to excavate.
Wow.
I mean, I don't think he was lifting dirt and moving dirt and so on. Is digging at Tel Dan. So for viewers who know the famous biblical expression from Dan to Beersheba, the geographical extremes of the land, Dan, in Hebrew Dan, or Tel Dan, the archaeological site, is in far northern Israel along the Lebanese borders, right, where Israel, Lebanon, and Syria come together. And if you picture the map, it's closer to Damascus by far than it is to, the rest of Israel.
Right.
That summer, Biran found an inscribed stone which mentions the top is broken. We can read the word I, but we can't figure out who the I is, except we know that it has to be Chazael, a king of Aram, centered in Damascus, mentioned in the Bible, in the book of Kings. And it says that, it's in first person, I, killed such and such king of Israel and such king of the house of David. Clearly written, Beit David, house of David.
Yes.
So this was the first reference ever to David being found in the historical archaeological record. Now, it's not contemporary, right? David's in the 10th century. This is 100 or 130 years later, after David lived. But what's interesting about the inscription is that Israel, this kingdom has split after the death of Solomon. Israel is called Israel, but Judah is not called Judah. Judah is called the house of David.
Interesting.
Which is the dynastic house, obviously.
Sure. Yeah.
So,
not unprecedented in
pardon?
ancient. It's not unprecedented in ancient Near Eastern literature to
very
refer
common,
to nations
very
this
common,
way.
in fact,
Right?
yeah. Now, when I teach this to my students, I always like to give them modern analogies. The name by which you call your country, like you're the kingdom of Judah, doesn't mean that your neighbors are going to call you that. The most famous example, of course, is Germany,
Right.
which the Germans call Deutschland,
Right.
which the English and Americans call Germany, and which the French call Allemand, right? And countries in English, Finland, Hungary, Greece, Korea, these are not the names of their countries if you were speaking those languages.
No, not at all.
Right? I'm not talking minor differences between Italia and Italy. I'm talking about like a totally different name,
completely
right?
different route. Yeah. So
the neighbors, the Arameans, obviously called the kingdom of Judah the house of David. Now, the inscription was found in July, I think. I show up in Jerusalem, I'm a young scholar still, in August, and all of Israeli archaeology and biblical studies is abuzz, and Benjamin Mazar, getting up in years, the entire circle of biblical scholars meets at Professor Mazar's house to have everybody there to talk about the inscription and celebrate its discovery. So I'm going to just throw out a bunch of names whom I remember in the room. So obviously Professor Mazar was there, Biran, who found it, Joseph Naved, the epigrapher, and then people like Shalom Paul and Aaron Dembski and Chaim Tadmor and Abraham Malamat and Moshe Greenberg, I remember, was there. I assume Weinfeld was there that evening. I'm trying to remember. I think Jonas Greenfield. All these people were there, and I was invited to come, by Professor Mazar. And he was beaming. He was beaming. It was almost as if I've waited my whole life to find David in the archaeological record, and now we found him. And he actually passed away, I believe, less than a year later in 1994.
Okay. Yeah.
But it was a magical evening to be in a room with the great Professor Mazar. Many of these, almost everybody I just mentioned had been his student, of course.
At some point, right. Yeah.
Especially Tadmor and Malamud were his two main students. And just to share that evening and, to try to work through the inscription and with everybody contributing a little bit, it was really just such a wonderful experience.
Right.
And I was able to spend some more private time with Mazar over the last couple of years of his life as well. He and Gordon had been very close back in the 1930s.
Oh, wow.
So they knew
back.
each other. And Gordon told me, as soon as you get to Jerusalem, you have to look up Professor Mazar and tell him you're my student.
Yeah.
But that was a whole generation of scholars.
Sure.
I tell my students, they all grew up in homes. Now, these were mainly Jewish scholars. In fact, everybody I just mentioned, especially the ones in Israel, were. But they grew up in homes where they just, obviously German was spoken in the home, but they all knew Hebrew and they all learned Aramaic, and then they went to gymnasium and they learned Greek and Latin, and then they started their education, right? So they had like not 1 foot, but 2 or 3 or 4 feet up on the education that you and I had,
right?
Because that was the
that was
the spirit of the
European
times
system,
and the tenor of how you became an academic.
Right.
And then they specialized. You learned a little more Akkadian, you learned a little more hieroglyphic, you did a little more this or whatever.
Right.
It's just remarkable.
Yeah. It's hard to attain that level of scholarship anymore because we don't start in childhood already getting, trained in the classical languages in the classics, the great body of literature that's the patrimony of our civilization.
Now, I will admit that there was a lot less to know.
That's true too.
The knowledge explosion today. You can't have an Albright or a Gordon anymore. If you're going to be a field archaeologist, that's what you're going to do. You're not going to be able to publish cuneiform tablets, and yet that generation was able to do both. So there's just too much specialization. Not just in our field, in medicine, in everything.
Yeah. There's something
I'm not a surgeon.
there.
I only do orthopedics. I'm sorry, I only do upper extremities, not lower extremities.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, or I only do lower extremities on children.
Right.
I don't work on adults, or I don't work on kids. And and something's lost there because Gordon and Albright's generation, these guys appreciated classical literature. They were well read in the great works of our culture, and so they were kind of Renaissance men in that sense, and we're bringing that all to bear on things that were very technical. Like digging up these inscriptions and so on, and now we're all kind of in our silos. And there's a loss because sometimes insights come from being aware of a broader perspective. I even see this at SPL. I'm more of a generalist because I teach across the Testaments, do work in New Testament, have a few publications actually in New Testament. Teaching undergrads, you teach undergrads as well. I'll go to sessions at SPL and I'll hear folks that say only work on prophets or only work on a single prophet.
That's amazing. I know.
Yeah, all I do is work on Ezekiel, and they'll sometimes they'll present hypotheses for explaining certain literary features in, for example, Ezekiel, and I'll be listening to it and think that can't be right because you seem, I don't say this to their face, but you seem to be unaware of what's going on in the rest of the biblical corpus. You're not recognizing that Ezekiel there is alluding to, for example, a Torah text. Now that's probably not the best example, but but this goes on, and so this so there is a role even in the current day for generalists, for general practitioners of Scripture who try to take it all in, because certain things can only be observed from the 30,000-foot perspective. So we've talked a lot about the development of our field. Where do you see things going as we head into the 21st century here? Do you see us going back to source criticism? Do you see a future for, obviously, you would hope for a future for the kind of literary approach that you've practiced throughout your career? Where do you see it? Or do you see just camps, the European camp, the Israeli camp, different camps in the U.S.?
Well, I think the camps will continue. And I actually never quite understood why where you're from should put you in a camp, right?
Right.
I mean, to some extent, the Israeli school I understand, although there are certainly divisions within Israeli scholarship, but they're by and large much more traditional, with one major exception, I think, much less devoted to the documentary hypothesis, much more rooted in historical, archaeological, and literary material. And a lot of that, of course, just comes from living in the land.
Right.
And knowing the land, right? Yeah. Which is important, especially if you're doing Samuel and, this place where, Samuel's visiting Saul and David's escaping over here, and, it's not such a big country. But why it should matter if you're in America or Europe, I never quite understood why that puts you in a particular school or a camp. But I suspect that all the differences that we see today in our field, some of which we've touched upon, or most of which we've touched upon, will continue. I still am surprised how little attention is paid to the linguistic material. It is the only objective standard we have.
Yeah.
And to put this in perspective, for people who know English, you can tell immediately that you're reading a 19th century novel versus a 17th century novel or a 21st century novel, just from looking at the language. Right. You don't have to be a Jane Austen expert to know that. You just know it. And yet these are the kinds of things that don't get talked about enough in our field. Right. Now it takes, what we're just talking about, it does take a little more advanced knowledge of the language to think about these things, but the tools are all out there, including people who've written at a more popular level on these kinds of issues. But I suspect that we'll just continue on passing each other like ships in the night, perhaps being cordial. And the documentarians will just continue on their merry way. And I don't know what it will take to actually, really shut down the operation. I just don't know. I would have thought that the literary approach would have done it.
Yeah.
And maybe it did for a while.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the neo part of the neo-documentarians.
Right. Well, towards the end of the 1990s, around the year 2000, I thought that we had passed the documentary hypothesis, that was over. I thought it looked like canonical criticism and literary approaches were taking over the field. And then there was a big shakeup at Yale with the retirement of Brevard Childs, and seats went someplace else. It was kind of his heir apparent. I think he went to Andrews University. University of St. Andrews in Scotland, something like that. And then there seemed to be a move back to source critical methodologies at Yale and Chicago, and kind of the bright future for the field that seemed to be on the horizon when I was finishing up my master's program. Never really materialized. And now I don't know where we are really.
I don't want to berate an entire group of people who are quite good at what they do, but it doesn't take much to do the documentary hypothesis.
Right.
it takes a special kind of Robert Alter brain to do this kind of literary analysis, to see things that you and I wouldn't see, right? And to do the linguistic work.
Right.
And I don't know where the next generation of scholars is doing that. Right?
Yeah.
I don't know where they're being trained.
Speaking of that, where would you encourage folks to go? And where have you encouraged your own undergraduates to go further in biblical studies right now?
Right. So I have sent students to, I recommend, if they're willing to travel overseas, to try Oxford or Cambridge.
Okay.
Right. Where there are, good people to study with. One of my students finished his former students, did an MA with me, finished a PhD in Cambridge.
Working with?
Jeffrey Kahn.
Okay.
Who's now just retired as we speak. And, one of my BA students went and did an MA at Oxford with your former teacher, Hindi Nyman. But I think the best places in the U.S., because of the people that are there, I think UCLA is a great place with Bill Schneidewin.
Okay.
For language people, I would say Toronto with Robert Holmstead. And I think Johns Hopkins is also still a good place to go.
Sure. With
Ted Lewis and Alice Mandel. So those are the places
you would encourage folks to
that
check
I would
out.
encourage students to look at.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Good.
And my own alma mater, NYU, still has a great cadre. Only one real full-time Bible person now, Dan Fleming, who's done some really good work. But on the larger Jewish studies realm, NYU is really a great place to be as well.
Good, good. Okay, Dr. Rendsburg, in the American Catholic Church right now, there is a tremendous fascination with Judaism. And my very close friend and colleague, Dr. Brant Petrie, has kind of made his career writing books called The Jewish Roots of This or The Jewish Roots of That. And I've cashed in on that a little bit myself with my book on Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Jewish, I don't forget what I called it, Jewish Roots of Christianity or something like this. But using the scrolls as a window into the relationship between early Christianity and Second Temple Judaism. However, although there's this fascination, there's also profound ignorance of contemporary Judaism as well as the history of Judaism and the difference between modern Judaism and the religion of ancient Israel and all these things. So I want to give you a platform to educate us Catholics on the different varieties or denominations within contemporary Judaism that you might encounter in the United States. And then maybe we could also move into talking about the complexities of Israel, which many Catholics encounter as pilgrims there. And kind of where that's, I know, touchy as religious identity and political identity and so on kind of gets mixed up in the state of Israel. But let's start with contemporary Judaism in America. What are the different traditions that are reflected? What are words like Reform, Conservative, Orthodox mean in that context?
If I may, I'd like to give a little historical context, especially because all of us are very biblically literate. And just to remind everyone that biblical Judaism, and we tend not to use the word Judaism, right? We actually talk about the religion of ancient Israel more, is priestly oriented. I mean, you see that, of course, when you read the Torah, and we've talked about some of these priestly texts, but if you read the end of Exodus and all of Leviticus and bits of Numbers, the worship of God is actually not very different than the worship of God in any other ancient religion, except it's in a portable shrine, a tabernacle, eventually a permanent one made out of stone, the temple built by Solomon, and then the second temple. But religion is in the hands of the priest, as it would have been in Canaan, Egypt, Babylonia, the Hittites, Greece, etc. In fact, I like to say that if you walked into the Jerusalem temple or an ancient Canaanite temple, visually, you may not have seen much difference, other than the fact that in the Jerusalem temple there was no idol of the god.
Okay.
But the priests offering animal sacrifices on an altar with incense and wine libations and so on was probably very similar.
Okay.
And in fact, some of the terminology is the same. We actually get some of the same words that are used for technical terms in the rituals in Canaanite material from Ugarit. All of that disappears in Judaism with the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 CE, never to be rebuilt.
Okay.
So we are now 1950 years later, which means that Judaism essentially reinvented itself from a priestly orientation to what we might call a congregational orientation.
Okay.
And the term rabbi, for example, never occurs in the Bible until we get to the Christian Bible, the New Testament, where it's used of two individuals, John the Baptist and Jesus himself. And basically it just means master, or more literally, my master. It's somebody who's mastered the legal material, leads a community of followers, which you see most, of course, with Jesus. And that sets a whole new stage for Judaism, which is going on now for almost 2 millennia. So when you get into the modern American world, we are the heirs to that post-biblical kind of Judaism, post-temple, post-biblical.
Would you call that rabbinic Judaism then?
The term would be rabbinic Judaism. Now, there is one group of Jews of whom there are almost none in America, but they're somewhat significant in Israel, called the Karaites, who are non-rabbinic.
Okay.
They are the heirs to a Sadducee tradition that we believe goes back to the time of the Sadducees in the Second Temple. But almost all the rabbinic, all modern Jewish movements are modern manifestations of the rabbinic movement, which in turn, to my mind and most people's minds, is an outgrowth of the Pharisee movement, which of course we know from the New Testament and Jewish sources. So how do we differentiate between and among all these groups? To put it in some sort of historical context, we are now in an age of reform, and I don't mean Reform Judaism. I mean no different than the Protestant Reformation, an age of humanism, the Enlightenment, that we are all heirs to now in the 21st century. So it took Judaism a little bit longer. Right? The Protestant Reformation happens early and in a radical way in the Low Countries, of course, and in a less radical way in England. Reform doesn't happen in Judaism until the 19th century, when you have the break with traditional Judaism, where enlightened Jewish figures started in the age of enlightenment, on the backside of the Age of Enlightenment, no longer believed that all of the rituals and beliefs were necessary, and that you could create a Judaism that was more modern.
Okay.
And that is the first break, and that creates Reform Judaism.
Okay.
Those that remain traditional then are called Orthodox. The word Orthodox had never been used before because everybody was Orthodox, as it were, or traditional. Everybody observed the Sabbath and the dietary laws and this and that. So the Reformed tradition, was much more lax on a number of the laws, rituals, including dietary laws, and would have introduced for the first time a sermon in the vernacular. So you could have a sermon in German in the German synagogue, in English in the American synagogue, and so on. An organ, very typical of European churches. Therefore, we can bring an organ into the synagogue. This would all have been part of the Reform movement. And many Reformed Jews are still like that down to the present day. The Orthodox movement remains traditional. No electricity on the Sabbath, no driving on the Sabbath and the holidays. Don't eat out in restaurants that are not kosher. Okay, that would be the Orthodox way. And then a middle ground grew up called conservative. And the conservative, per its name, were actually a reaction to the Reform. They also wanted to liberalize, but they wanted to conserve or preserve a good part of traditional Judaism. So they're a middle ground. They may drive to synagogue, but then go home and don't go shopping. Or don't go to the sporting event. Right? Or to the mall or the beach, right? They will eat in non-kosher restaurants, but will only eat the permitted foods, not the meat, but they would eat fish or pasta or something like that.
Right.
So we have these three groups, the Reform being the most liberal, the conservative in the middle, and the Orthodox retaining most of the traditions. Okay. And we also live in a world with some more minor movements. There's a Reconstructionist movement.
What is that about?
The Reconstructionist movement was an offshoot of Judaism, which wanted to emphasize Jewish civilization. We are heirs to a long tradition that we don't want to break up, that we don't want to sever, but we don't have to be theistic anymore, right? So we can be I don't want to say atheistic, we can be non-theistic traditional Jews.
That's interesting.
It's a pretty small group, but they exist. And of course, once you reach the 21st century, because Jews are affected by the world around them, you get what I might call, for lack of a better word, New Age Judaism.
Okay.
Right? The Jewish environmental movement, the Jewish food movement, the Jewish culture movement, whatever brings you to your Judaism. Mm-hmm. And so these are all elements. And Judaism today is a very pluralistic umbrella, of all of these groups. Some of the groups, the more Orthodox, and then within the Orthodox umbrella, there are the Orthodox who are part of the modern world in America. Their children go to universities, they hold jobs in the usual places, in medicine, engineering, whatever. And then there are the ultra-Orthodox who are more visibly Orthodox, concentrated mainly in New York, but elsewhere, including the Hasidim, who don't participate in modern American culture to the same extent. Their children don't go to universities, for example.
So this will almost be like the Amish in a sense.
A bit of an Amish style.
Like a rejection of modern culture.
Rejection of modern culture. Right.
Yeah, that's within Hasidism, right?
Yeah, but they will use electricity, of course, not on Sabbath. But the Amish are still not using electricity, right? And they'll, they'll have cars and they'll fly and they'll do. Right. But they'll cut themselves. They won't have televisions.
Okay.
They'll have smart phones and smart computers, which not are like your smartphone to my smartphone, which allow them only to access permitted websites and things like that.
Okay. Interesting.
You might learn something on Wikipedia that isn't right, or you might see something on Facebook that, So they have these, where you can only access the Talmud online or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a panoply of movements.
Right.
And to some extent, we attend a conservative synagogue, but we're also, which allows us to retain the traditions which we love and to be part of a more liberal world, right? Mm-hmm. Personally, the Orthodox, whom we respect, retain these traditions which we want to see liberalized a little bit. So, for example, we are egalitarian. The Orthodox tradition, the Orthodox synagogues, women do not lead prayers, they do not read from the Torah, and so on. And in the conservative movement, we follow the same prayer book, but we allow women to participate, lead the service, read the Torah, and so on.
Okay, so it's more.
And the Reform movement has a more the service is much shorter, and some of the prayers are done in English.
Okay.
Hopefully, does that all help?
Yeah,
Did
it
I
does.
mystify or demystify?
No, I think that's helped. So the three big traditions represented in the United States would be Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox, and they vary in the degree of kind of acceptance of modern cultural norms and the degree to which they retain elements of Jewish tradition. So Orthodox are going to retain the most continuity with pre-modern Jewish tradition. Conservative is an accommodating position, and Reform is kind of more, we might say, progressive or embracing of modern culture.
Most conservative Jews would keep a kosher home and may only eat kosher food when they're not at home. Right. And most Reform Jews would not keep a kosher home.
Don't keep kosher. Okay.
Right, so they would eat whatever is permitted. Their understanding being that the dietary laws are outdated and outmoded. They may have served 3,000 years ago, and they're not part of our 21st century world.
Right. Okay.
So,
now, if Are Christians, I'm sure this is the case depending on what synagogue, but can a Christian visit a synagogue and observe a
yes.
a prayer service?
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Okay, how would one go about doing that?
Well, if you have you could just show up, but if you might be a little perplexed if you didn't have somebody to guide you along and so on.
Right.
So if you have a neighbor or a friend or
A Jewish friend can take you?
Absolutely. We have brought our Christian neighbors who have expressed an interest to come and I know we do it at Rutgers in our comparative religion courses. One of the exercises is to go visit a religious tradition that you don't know.
Right.
So so the students will be sent out to a Sikh temple or to a Hindu temple or to a mosque or to this. I don't know if you're Christian, can you go to another denomination? I don't know. If you're Jewish, you can't. You have to go find some other. So I think you have to. Yes, but usually write to the local clergy person. Mm-hmm. So. Everyone is very open to welcoming.
Okay.
Well, it's a good biblical tradition to welcome the stranger.
Right.
I mean, it's what we do.
Yeah.
Following Abraham, but then also laws of the Torah to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, but depending on what, if a Catholic would visit a synagogue, depending on which kind of synagogue it is, it might be quite different, as you described.
The Orthodox one would be the hardest to follow. The
Right.
conservative one would be easy enough to follow, and the Reform would be even easier.
Even easier to follow, yeah.
And all the prayer books, even in the Orthodox synagogues, are bilingual. So you'll have the Hebrew on the one page and the English on the other.
Right. Okay.
And if sometimes they'll announce pages, and you'll just know where you are, and you just follow along. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Now, is all that also true of Judaism in the state of Israel?
So in Israel, it's a charged situation. Somewhat officially, Israel is Orthodox.
Okay.
Which is to say, the government authorities are Orthodox. Which is to say, this can come down to real practical matters. The Ministry of Tourism, which gives the certification to the hotels and so on, they have to be kosher kitchens, kosher food, kosher dining, and so on, according to Orthodox
standards,
rabbinic supervision.
Okay.
Right? You couldn't have a conservative rabbi come in there and say, "I'm going to make, I want to check out your kitchen." So they all have to be Orthodox. They all under Orthodox supervision, and arms of the government. Everything's closed on Saturday, on Shabbat. Right. Mm-hmm. Museums stay open. Free admission. Mm-hmm. They don't charge. But I think those are some good examples, right?
Sure.
The conservative and reform movements have tried to break that monopoly over the last 30, 40, 50 years and successfully are doing more of it. Here's a good example, again, of the monopoly that the Orthodox have. If you're in Israel and you want to convert to Judaism, mm-hmm. I think the only way to be recognized by the state mm-hmm. would be if your conversion went through an Orthodox rabbi.
Okay.
The Supreme Court of Israel did rule, however, that if you converted outside the land of Israel with a conservative or reform rabbi, you must be accepted as a Jew in the land by the state. On your citizenship papers, it'll say Jewish. And I think they're now making inroads in that direction, even within the land. Ditto for marriage. A married couple used to be married could be married only by an Orthodox rabbi. I think the Supreme Court has ruled that you have to recognize, the state has to recognize weddings performed by conservative and reform rabbis as well.
Okay.
And this is, of course, for the 80% of the population which is Jewish, and for the 20% of the population which is not, there are similar guidelines for the Muslim and Christian, Druze, Samaritan, Baha'i. I think I've covered them all, populations.
Okay. So this is another thing that befuddles American pilgrims / tourists, the assumption that Israeli means Jewish.
Right.
That's not the case, though.
Right. So I just said 80%. It may even be 70, 75% of the people of Israel are Jewish.
Okay.
So it clearly is the dominant culture,
Right.
by design, but the religious minorities are all there, and by law, of course, all religious minorities are respected, and they receive funding from the government for churches, mosques. I believe that's the case.
Right. So you can be a Muslim Israeli or a
Christian Israeli.
Christian Israeli.
Right. Now,
Right.
most of them are Arabs.
Right.
The non-Jewish population are mostly Arabs, so you have Christian Arabs and Muslim Arabs.
Right.
There are villages which are entirely Christian and entirely Muslim.
Right.
But then in the larger cities, Jerusalem, obviously, Tel Aviv, Haifa, you have mixed populations.
Sure.
So you'll have populations of Jews and Christians and Muslims living
Right.
together, not always in the same neighborhood, maybe in separate
Right.
neighborhoods, but they encounter each other on a very regular basis. Yeah.
Right.
Almost
So you could
impossible.
have-
Yeah. And then there are these very small communities,
Sure.
the Samaritans being the smallest, in which you have a special interest, the Druze,
Right.
and a small Baha'i community. Yeah.
Right. Talk to us for just a moment about the Samaritan community, because I think many American Catholics aren't aware that there is a continuing Samaritan.
So we read about the Samaritans in the Bible. I mean, most famously in the parable of the Good Samaritan, but in the Gospels. But you also have the Samaritans mentioned prominently in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Mm-hmm. So the Samaritans are the remnants of the northern kingdom of Israel. If you know your biblical history, the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians in 722, 721. Right. Kingdom of Judah would last another 140 years till it was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586. And the Jews are the outgrowth of the Judaism, is the ism of that kingdom of Judah, right? That's Judaism. And in English, we take the first syllable and create the word Jew, or plural Jews. If you speak German, you still hear the Juda in the D part of Jude. Sounds much closer to Judah. But the Samaritans are the tiny remnant left of the northern kingdom remnants.
Wow.
And
Still
there are
in
fewer than
existence.
1,000 Samaritans today.
Really?
And they are still worshiping God on Mount Gerizim as they were 2,500 years ago. Samaritans and Jews are exceedingly close to one another, and the Samaritans canonized only the Torah, which actually mentions Mount Gerizim and the neighboring mountain, Mount Ebal, in the book of Deuteronomy, and they worship God on Mount Gerizim. Jews and Samaritans are worshiping the same God. They have the same Torah, but the textual fluidity questions show up there, which means that the Samaritans are observing the Shabbat, the Sabbath, the same as the Jews, the same dietary laws, the same festivals, Yom Kippur, etc., same circumcision ritual, but a distinct community.
Wow.
It's a fascinating community to observe.
Yeah,
a
absolutely.
living tradition of biblical times, and are still heavily priestly.
Yeah.
Although they don't have a temple either, their temple was destroyed as well, but they're still led by a priestly group.
Sure. So they're offering animal sacrifice according to the
Only on
regulations.
Passover.
They
got rid of the rest of them. They continue to do the Passover sacrifice.
Oh, interesting. But not the tamid or
No daily or other sacrifices.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But they still do it on Passover.
But they would not consider themselves to be Jews.
They're not Jews. They don't consider themselves to be Jews, and Jews don't consider them to be Jews. They're a separate minority religious group.
Yeah.
But they are part of the house of Israel.
Right. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a
Yes,
really remarkable
absolutely.
thing. They are part of the house of Israel.
Right. Yeah.
DNA studies show almost no distinction between Jews and Samaritans.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I talk to my students about this. The distinction between the terms Hebrew, Israelite, and Jew.
Yeah.
Because Abraham is a Hebrew, but it would make no sense to call him a Jew.
Right.
Even though he's considered the father of the
Right.
Jews, but he's
Right.
also father of the Arabs.
Right.
So
Right.
this is very complex.
Yeah.
And the fact that when you visit Israel, you can have someone who is an Israeli citizen, but an Arab. See, Americans think all Arabs are Muslim.
Right.
but an Israeli citizen, an Arab, and a Christian.
Right.
You know, and it's like, whoa, you know.
Right. So in Bethlehem and Nazareth, I think most of the population are Christian.
That. Right. Yeah. They're Israeli. Well, let's see. Now, Bethlehem is in the
West Bank. But they would be mainly Christian.
Nazareth is in the state of Israel.
Nazareth heavily Christian within Israel.
Yeah.
And you know, also to keep in mind, within the Christian, they're not Arabs, but they're Christians of Israel. You would have Greek Orthodox,
correct,
pretty good community, Armenian,
right,
community, and a Latin, what's called the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, supervising the Catholics of the country.
Yeah. So different identities, and I think this is important because. You know, I will hear things in homilies like Moses led the Jews across the Red Sea.
We all cringe at that way.
You know,
what about the other 11 tribes?
Right. And people have visions of, you know, folks dressed in long, dark
caftans,
and exotic headwear.
Right.
Talk to us about that a little bit. Some of the distinctive style of dress that's associated with the more, Orthodox Judaism. Where does that style of dress come from, and what is its meaning?
So the Hasidic dress, and I'm not an expert on this, remember my world, like your world, is ancient Israel. The Hasidic dress, the Hasidic movement means pious people, by the way. Hasidim means the pious ones. It started in the 18th century in Eastern Europe.
Okay. In
the Ukraine, Poland, what is today Belarus, that was the heartland of the Hasidic movement. And this was the dress of the nobility of that time period.
Okay.
If you look at the artwork of a Polish or Ukrainian nobleman in the 18th century, that's what they're wearing. These silk long coats and fur hats. And they modeled themselves to elevate themselves out of what was otherwise a very impoverished lifestyle, to sort of emulate the aristocrats of their realm, and that stuck. So they are stuck in the 18th century, both untouched by the Enlightenment and in their dress.
Interesting. Yeah. So the dress isn't even necessarily originally Jewish,
right?
But you know, a Catholic Polish nobility might have wore those large, you know, fur hats and so on. That was taken over from Polish or Lithuanian culture.
Less Lithuania, Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
So it's a fascinating aspect.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, but if you think about it, no different than you and I are wearing you know, jackets and pocket scarves. Well, I don't think my people or your people invented that. We probably got it from looking at nice British people. And
the Roman collar, you know, is a kind of a fixed fashion statement from, I think it's the Renaissance or something like this. I don't know exactly, but it was quite literally the style of dress that was common in Rome. And since so many Catholic clergy went to Rome to study, they came back wearing, and it became associated actually with the clerical state. Although it wasn't originally any like a liturgical vestment or of any kind.
There is a term in anthropology called elite emulation, which would speak to that. And today, I mean, look at Japanese and now sometimes Chinese businessmen dressing up like Europeans with suits and ties.
Right.
Right. It's so out of Place in East Asia.
Right.
Sure. But it's what we do.
Right.
Or another good example, of course, would be the matriculation and graduation ceremonies at Oxford and Cambridge, and also some of the European universities, Bologna, some of the old universities, you have to dress up in those medieval gowns.
Right, yes, indeed, yeah.
Keep the tradition alive.
Sure.
So we've been doing it for 800 years, we shouldn't stop now. Right?
Yeah.
So, great stuff.
It is. Now, you know, I think it was John D. Levinson, some years ago, wrote an article where I think it was entitled "Why Jews Aren't Interested in Biblical Theology," and his argument was that from a Jewish perspective, when one reads Scripture, one's looking primarily for halakha, for how does one live, how does one obey the law, And if one obeys the law, then one is acting within the covenant, and that's what's important. And kind of theological extractions are not so necessary. Do you agree with this thesis, or what do you think of that?
No, I do. I think there's something to it. John Levinson is our colleague at Harvard Divinity School. I think there is absolute truth to what he says there. I like to put it into perspective, and this will certainly speak to people who have a good grasp on church history, especially Catholic church history. So if you go back to the 4th and 5th centuries, right, you have this body of patristic material, St. Augustine being the most famous, but so many of the other of the church fathers who are writing what we would call theological treatises on the nature of God and the nature of Christ and the nature of the Trinity and all the arguments that are being presented at the time. Exactly at that time period, the rabbis are in their academies, both in the land of Israel and in Babylonia, writing the Talmud of the two. There's two Talmudim, two Talmuds of the two countries, where they are hashing out legal opinions. So it actually goes back to that, I think. In other words, the patristic literature spawns an entirety of theological writing. I mean, through the Middle Ages, again, Aquinas would be the most well-known, into the 20th and 21st century. I mean, we can, you can bring in C.S. Lewis and N.T. Wright and everybody into this tradition. And Jews typically are still doing matters of halakha, the word for Jewish law.
Okay.
And to put this into perspective, again, for the biblically literate, I mean, a couple of teachable examples. From Leviticus, but it appears elsewhere too, you have to leave the corners of your field for the poor people to come and glean. That's all it says. Well, what kind of legal questions come to mind here? How poor do you have to be? How much of the corner of your field? Right? What percentage of your
maybe field? What is the corner of the field?
What
perhaps?
Is the corner of your field? Right? All these. Those are the two major legal questions, right?
Right.
And so these are all hashed out, I guess, in the first body of post-biblical Jewish law called the Mishnah, and then even more so in the two Talmud collections of the two lands of Israel and Babylonia, where various legal opinions are given. Right? Or we know from Deuteronomy that divorce is permitted, but it doesn't answer all sorts of, and the only thing that's really stated that you have to have a written document.
Right.
But it doesn't tell you what are the grounds for divorce.
Right.
I mean, the questions in our minds, because we live in the 21st century, I mean, things like alimony, child support, and what is the written document? What is the wording of the document? Can I simply say, I divorce you and you're gone, you're no longer my wife?
Right.
These things are all going to be discussed in Jewish law and Jewish legal debates. And Jewish scholars, it resonates, more than 1,000 years later to 21st century Jewish scholars. I guess it was the 20th century when John Levinson wrote the article, where theology is less of a concern, right? In the huge corpora of Jewish text, you don't get these issues that are forefronted in the Christian, especially Catholic tradition. You get some of it in the medieval tradition. When Jews are exposed to medieval Islamic philosophy, you'll get some theological writing, especially from Maimonides in the 12th century, the greatest of all the Jewish scholars of the Middle Ages. But by and large, they stay away from the theological issues. Maybe there's less to worry about if you don't have a Trinity. You only have a God, and we know what God is. I'm sort of saying that with a smile, but maybe somewhat seriously, because those were real issues in the patristic times.
Absolutely, yeah. Right, yeah, Christology. Yeah. Well, Christology is hand-in-hand with the doctrine of the Trinity.
Yeah.
You got to both get them right.
There were heresies that had to be dealt with, right?
Right,
There were none of that in Judaism.
Right, very different. That's fascinating and instructive to understand that.
So I think that's where it comes from. But Yeah, I think John Levinson was
was onto
there.
something. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. All right. We just have a few moments left. I want to talk about your current work. I want to promote your books. I love Redaction Genesis. Is that still in print? For a while, it was out. It is again.
Eisenbrauns came out with a second edition in 2013.
Okay.
I didn't change a word, but wrote. It would have been too difficult to start. I would have done it, but I just wrote a 20, 30-page introduction with looking back after a course of 20 years on the book. So the second edition is available.
Okay. Yeah.
And
strongly influenced my Catholic Introduction to the Bible, Old Testament, which I co-authored with Brant Petrie. Very influential on all our work on Genesis. It's basically
thanks,
an adaptation of your understanding of the structure.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Other books that are out that you're excited about that you can talk about. Your work with Cyrus Gordon on was it Israel and the Ancient Near East?
The Bible and the Ancient Near East.
The Bible and the Ancient Near East. Again, that was my constant companion while I was writing the introduction to the Old Testament. It was always on my desk, always consulting and seeing how you guys, weighed the evidence and very, very invaluable. But that's still in print. And
I think it still can be purchased. It may not be in print officially anymore.
Okay.
The publisher W.W. Norton may still list it. I don't remember, depending on if they have some back stock. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But some of your works that are in print.
Well, all the other books are mainly linguistic, for those who want to read about regional dialects of ancient Hebrew and the Diglossia of ancient Hebrew. But my most recent book, published in 2019, is called How the Bible is Written.
Yes.
Published by Hendrickson. It's definitely still in print. It is the culmination of a life engagement with the biblical text.
Okay.
I work at the nexus of language and literature, which has come out in our conversation today. And so all manner of literary devices with strict attention to the language and the linguistic material is in that book.
Nice.
Alliteration, repetition with variation. The biblical authors repeat passages, but almost always vary the language ever so slightly.
Sure.
And I go across various genres, prose, poetry, etc. Confused language. The biblical writers will write in a confused stop and start manner, which again, those who like to amend biblical texts will say, we have to amend the text. No. There's usually a confusion in the scene at the moment.
Okay.
And the biblical authors will create an ungrammatical syntax even to reflect the confusion of the moment, right?
Interesting.
Analogy, think about film directors.
Sure.
Will just like create
shake the camera a little bit.
Shake the camera or, create some sort of bewilderment scene by their filming, right?
Right.
So all of that's in the book, along with my critique of the documentary hypothesis and much more. So that's for people who really want to get to the heart of my work.
Your contribution
How
to
the Bible is Written is the book up until the moment that I'm most proud of.
Yeah.
But I have two current projects. The one that will come out first, probably early next year, is a commentary on the book of 1 Samuel. But I'm reading the proofs, but I'm already started writing commentary on 2 Samuel, but I've only gotten to chapter 5. So 1 Samuel has 31 chapters. It's quite a bit.
Right.
And it's such a rich narrative.
Yes.
I mean, you have Samuel and Saul and David, and you have these remarkable female characters of Hannah
indeed.
And Michal and Abigail, and the woman whom we usually call the Witch of Endor, we'll call her the necromancer of Endor. And I do the literary analysis and the linguistic analysis when necessary. In both How the Bible is Written and in my Samuel commentary, forthcoming, every word I deal with appears in Hebrew transliteration and translation.
Nice.
So I'll write the word melech, and then in English, M-E-L-E-K, and then in quotation marks, king, right? So you get it 3 times, depending on, if you know Hebrew, you can follow along, right?
Right.
If you know Hebrew, you can skip the English part, the book's in English, but you can skip the translation, I guess. So, and that's going to be true of this new Samuel commentary. But at the same time, I pay attention to the history, the archaeology.
Sure.
Every time there's a place mentioned, I talk about where it is in Israel, if there have been archaeological excavations, who's excavated,
Right.
and what have we learned from the excavations. So,
Sure.
it's a pretty comprehensive.
Sounds like a wonderful resource.
Yeah. And of course, an introduction, which we'll talk about, the historical background and the literary style, and what can we say about David in history, and so on. Yeah.
Sure.
So
this is continuing the famous JPS Torah commentary, with
Right.
Sarna and Tigay
Yes.
and Milgrom. And,
Right. This is an ongoing series. They did the Torah volumes back in the 70s and 80s into maybe the Deuteronomy one came out last 2000 something.
Okay.
But there have been other volumes that have been produced on Jonah, Song of Songs, and now they're doing a Psalms series,
Okay.
and they're doing Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and I was honored to be asked to do the Samuel one.
Yeah.
So
Congratulations.
it's amazing. There's nothing like discovering the biblical text
Sure.
through writing a commentary.
Right.
Because you open up the page, you look at it and say, close, I found what I need, you close it.
Right.
When you write a commentary, you make all sorts of discoveries.
Oh.
Much of it probably discovered by people before you, but you're
Right.
discovering it yourself now.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Oh, it is delightful. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
That's book number 1.
Yeah.
And book number 2, and we touched upon it, is a new dictionary of the Ugaritic language.
talk to us about the importance of Ugaritic studies.
Yeah.
For Scripture.
So, Ugarit is a city in far northern Canaan. In fact, it's actually beyond the bounds of Canaan, but it reflects Canaanite culture. It's in modern-day Syria on the Mediterranean coast. So if you picture the map,
So
you
north of Lebanon.
you go north of Israel, you traverse all of Lebanon, and north of Lebanon, you get Syria has
piece.
a small piece of the Mediterranean coast, and that's where Ugarit is. And starting around 1930, scholars found clay tablets there, written in a new alphabetic script, in a new language hitherto unknown called Ugaritic, which was easily deciphered. It is exceedingly close to Hebrew. I would
Yes.
say 80% overlap in the vocabulary.
Yes.
And the wonder of Ugarit is that it gave us myths about the gods, Baal, the gods mentioned in the Bible, Baal, Anat, Asherah. These are deities that we know from the Bible. And Elijah most famously has the contest with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. We now know the whole Baal story.
Sure.
But there are epics about human heroes, one of whom is a childless hero. Think Abraham, right? Same kind of
Dynamic.
idea. It's exceedingly close. They date to the 14th, 13th century. So, just as Israel's coming onto the scene of history. And we really don't have a good working dictionary. Again, Cyrus Gordon produced one back starting in the 40s, 50s, and the last edition was 1965. That's quite a long time ago now.
It is.
And here we are, 60 years later, we have double the amount of texts, a greater, through further excavations at the site, we have a greater understanding of the material. And I'm writing a new dictionary, which will be so useful for biblical studies because I'm pointing out the similarities between the Ugaritic material and the biblical material.
Yes.
I'm highlighting the similarities. Right?
Yeah, this is wonderful because we don't have a lot of ancient Hebrew.
Right.
We obviously
Outside of the Bible.
Outside of the
Right.
Bible, yeah. And in that sense, we do have a lot, but most of it's within the Bible, and so, for rarely used biblical words, hapax legomena, one-time occurrences, and so on. Oftentimes, we only have context to go on and maybe looking at the Semitic root or something like this.
Yeah.
So, since Ugaritic is so closely related to Hebrew, it's like having an additional corpus
Exactly.
of very closely related texts to compare.
Yeah.
When I was working on my dissertation on the Jubilee year, Leviticus 25, there's there's a term in Leviticus 25. It's virtually a one-off. I don't think it occurs elsewhere, but it's zemitut. It means in perpetuity.
Yeah.
And it's only found elsewhere in the Ugarit texts,
Right.
which are from, what do you date them to?
The 14th, 13th century.
Yeah, so very ancient.
Yeah.
Now, half of the resources that I was using were claiming that Leviticus is being written in the 5th century or something like this. And I'm thinking, well, if that's the case, why do we have this very close linguistic tie to a 14th century?
Yeah.
So I think
that word appears near the end of the Hebrew alphabet, so I'm not there yet. I'm only about halfway through. So when I get to the Tzadi material, I will look at your Jubilees material.
Well, I don't say very much about it, but
it's still good to have a reference to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think. So this is great. Do you think when I was in seminary, I think this was the 90s. It seemed to me like there was more interest in Ugaritic studies, and that seemed to wane. I don't know, but I attributed it to the rise of all this late dating. So if in Europe, if everybody in Europe is thinking, well, all these are 5th century texts, 4th century texts, they just stop looking at the Assyrian literature, the Mesopotamian, the Ugaritic literature. Do you think that's true?
No, definitely. In fact, one of my goals in the dictionary, this is a trend I've noticed. Since I was a student, a little bit before you, but also when you were a student, Ugaritic studies was part of biblical studies.
Sure.
In the intervening decades, it's now not part of biblical studies as much as it is what we call Semitic studies. Okay. In other words, you learn Ugaritic because you want to be an expert in the Semitic languages, and that's fine. That's fine in and of itself. You put it in as one of the Semitic languages along with Aramaic and Akkadian and Arabic and Ethiopic, fine. But you can do both. It's not a choice. You could, and I am reclaiming it for biblical studies.
Thank you.
So when there is a word, a rare word in the Bible, like the one you just mentioned or some of the other ones, and it occurs in Ugaritic, that should be noted in a dictionary.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it'll help the biblical scholar to access the Ugaritic material.
Yeah.
And I'm quoting entire passages and showing the key word in context so you'll actually understand that this is the way the word is used.
Yeah.
It's
invaluable work.
And again, I'm learning so much.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure it's got to be fascinating. Yeah. I really appreciate that kind of work that you're doing. So much of what goes on in our field is these kind of ideological criticisms and, post-colonial whatever readings, and okay, fine, if you have funding to do that,
right?
And somebody wants to read what you're doing, that's all great. But you're doing, kind of, I think of it as meat and potatoes biblical research, like language, history, archaeology. These are relatively objective disciplines that advance the field.
All I've ever wanted to know, you too, is what does the text mean?
Yeah,
that's all I want to know.
Right.
And when you get involved with ideologies,
right, that's more like how I react to the text in whatever time.
And this fad, all I want to know is what the text means.
Yeah.
And these are tools. This will be a tool to let us know that.
Yeah.
It'll be a boon to biblical. It'll be a boon to Ugaritic studies for sure, but it'll be a boon to biblical scholarship.
Yeah.
So, 5 years, 3 years, 4 years. I don't know. Well, it'll be there. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm gonna hopefully publish it as a book, but also open access. Free download online.
Oh, wonderful.
I'm not going to make money writing a Ugaritic dictionary, so I might as well open it to the world.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Well, that's a great way to conclude. Dr. Gary Rendsburg, thank you so much for being on STEM.
It's great, John. Thank you so much for hosting me.
Yeah.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, mine too. Yeah, good.